The appeal of extreme underground exploration is that it forces you to face a completely absolute kind of darkness. When you are hundreds of feet below the surface of the Earth, there is no ambient light from the stars, no distant rumble of traffic, and no cellular connection to the outside world. If your equipment fails, or if you lose your way, the silence that settles around you is so heavy it can drive a person completely insane. But for 28-year-old hydrogeology graduate student Owen Vance, a solo mapping expedition into an abandoned zinc mine in northern Illinois in the spring of 2016 would turn into a horrifying confrontation with something that science could not explain. He would discover that a single photograph, taken in a place where no sunlight has reached for millions of years, could capture a living nightmare. The setting for this story is the rural outskirts of Galena, Illinois. It was the 12th of May 2016, a cold, rainy Thursday where a relentless spring downpour had turned the rolling hills into a sea of thick mud. The air outside was heavy and damp, but down inside the forgotten shafts of the Blackjack mine, the atmosphere was completely stagnant, freezing, and smelled sharply of oxidized iron, wet clay, and ancient rot. Owen was an incredibly meticulous researcher. He was working on his master's thesis, documenting the water quality in flooded, historic mine workings across the Midwest. He carried state-of-the-art gear, including a waterproof tactical backpack, a high-grade digital camera with a powerful detachable strobe flash, and a dual-battery headlamp that could throw a beam of white light for over 200 feet. Around 2:15 p.m., Owen descended the rusted iron rungs of the main air shaft, stepping off onto the floor of the mine's third level, exactly 300 feet beneath the surface. The old timber supports groaned under the immense weight of the earth above, and the only sound was the steady, rhythmic dripping of groundwater pooling in the dark, narrow tunnels. Drip, pause, drip. For nearly 3 hours, Owen walked through the desolate, stone-walled drifts, taking water samples and using a laser distance meter to map the dimensions of the passages. The blue-white beam of his headlamp cut through the heavy mist, illuminating the old rusted tracks where ore carts used to run over a century ago. At exactly 5:10 p.m., Owen reached a remote, dead-end tunnel at the very back of the third level. The passage terminated in a massive, ragged cavern where a portion of the ceiling had collapsed decades earlier, creating a steep mountain of shattered limestone boulders that blocked any further progress. Owen set his backpack down on a dry wooden crate, pulled out a fresh bottle of water, and decided to take a series of wide-angle photographs of the collapse site to include in his thesis presentation. He mounted his camera onto a lightweight tripod, adjusted the focus toward the top of the boulder pile, and connected his external strobe flash. He pressed the shutter button. The powerful strobe flash exploded with a brilliant, blinding pop of white light, completely illuminating the massive cavern, the jagged limestone blocks, and the dark, deep recesses of the ceiling with the intensity of a lightning strike. The light vanished instantly, returning the room to the narrow, steady beam of his headlamp. Owen walked over to the tripod, looking down at the small LCD preview screen on the back of his camera to review the quality of the shot. As the digital image rendered on the screen, the smile completely vanished from Owen's face. The photograph was perfectly sharp. It showed the mountain of shattered limestone and the rotten timber framing of the ceiling. But crouching right near the very top of the boulder pile, fully illuminated by the white glare of the strobe, was a shape. The anatomy was completely wrong. It was a towering, skeletal entity, its body so emaciated that its ribs and elongated spine pushed sharply against its skin like jagged ridges. The flesh was a dull, leathery, bruised gray color, completely hairless and glistened with a thick, clear fluid that looked like liquid mucus. Its double-jointed limbs were twice the length of a normal human's, its long arms ending in multi-jointed fingers with sharp black claws that were buried deep into the limestone dust. But it was the head that made the breath catch sharply in Owen's throat. The creature's neck was long, thin, and twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle, causing its hairless head to hang completely upside down between its broad shoulders. It had no visible nose or ears, just a smooth, pale skull. But where the eyes should have been, the camera flash had caught the brilliant, blinding reflection of two massive, glassy black orbs. The creature was staring straight into the camera lens, its unhinged jaw wide open, revealing a series of jagged, calcified ridges running along its gums. Owen stood perfectly paralyzed in the dark tunnel, the small screen of his camera illuminating his face in a pale blue glow. His logical brain tried to reject it. He told himself it was a shadow, a trick of the light against the sharp angles of the broken stone. He slowly raised his head, his hand shaking violently as he directed the bright blue-white beam of his headlamp toward the top of the boulder pile. The rocks were completely empty. There was nothing but gray limestone and deep, silent shadows. Owen let out a ragged, trembling breath, trying to calm his racing pulse. He reached down to turn off his camera, intending to pack his gear and leave the mine immediately. Then, from the darkness at the top of the boulder pile, came a sound. It wasn't a rock shifting, and it wasn't the wind. It was a low, rapid, dry clicking noise, the rhythmic chattering of bone against bone, click, 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 click. And as Owen watched in absolute, unadulterated horror, the two massive, glassy black orbs materialized out of the dark, hovering just above the topmost boulder, reflecting the beam of his headlamp with a cold, predatory glare. The creature began to slide down the rock pile, its long limbs moving with a fluid, insect-like velocity, heading straight toward the floor of the tunnel. The rapid, chattering sound accelerated as the creature descended the loose rocks, its long, double-jointed limbs moving in a chaotic, spider-like scramble that sent a mini avalanche of gray limestone pebbles rattling down onto the tunnel floor. Owen completely broke. He didn't try to fold his tripod or pack his samples. He turned on his heel and sprinted down the narrow, pitch-black drift, his boots splashing violently through the cold orange mine water that pool-flooded the floor. The tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare. The blue-white beam of his headlamp bounced wildly off the sweating rock walls and the rotten timber supports that looked ready to collapse under the pressure of the earth. The air felt incredibly thick, turning hot and suffocating, carrying that sharp, copper-like stench of stagnant river water and old rot that filled his throat with every desperate breath. Behind him, from the dark cavern, the sound changed. It wasn't just a scramble anymore. It was a heavy, wet, sliding motion, followed by the solid, rhythmic thud of four emaciated limbs striking the mine floor at an impossible speed. Thump, 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 thump. The entity was tracking the heavy vibration of his footsteps through the water, closing the distance with an insect-like velocity. Owen reached the junction of Level 3's main tracking line, his lungs burning, his chest heaving. He knew the main air shaft, his only way out, was still about 200 yards away. He looked over his left shoulder for a fraction of a second as he rounded the bend. Just 30 feet behind him, fully caught in the trailing edge of his headlamp glare, was the entity. It was crawling on all fours, its long, leathery gray torso compressed flat against the rusted ore tracks, its thin neck twisted at that horrific 90-degree angle. Its upside-down face was fixed directly on him, its unhinged jaw wide open as a clear, viscous fluid dripped from its calcified ridges into the muddy water. Owen screamed a raw sound of pure survival terror and pushed his legs to their absolute limit. He reached the base of the main air shaft, his hands slamming against the cold, rusted iron rungs of the vertical ladder that led 300 feet up to the surface. He began to climb, pulling his weight upward with a frantic, adrenaline-fueled strength. He was 10 feet up, 15 feet up, 20 feet up, his boots slipping against the wet iron bars. Below him, the clicking sound stopped. Owen stopped climbing for a split second, looking straight down into the black void of the shaft. The creature was standing at the base of the ladder, its 7-foot frame fully illuminated by the downward beam of Owen's headlamp. It didn't try to climb the rungs like a human. It slowly tilted its hairless skull back, its two massive glassy black orbs dilating as they absorbed the intense white light without a single blink. Then, with a sudden fluid grace, it leaped straight onto the vertical rock wall of the shaft, its black claws digging deep into the solid granite face as it began to scamper upward like a massive gecko, heading straight for his heels. Owen scrambled up the remaining rungs, his hands raw and bleeding from the rough iron, his mind fracturing into total madness. He could hear the creature's claws ripping through the rock just inches below his boots. Scrape, snap, scrape. As Owen reached the final 10 feet of the shaft, where the iron rungs met the concrete collar of the surface opening, his head burst through into the cold, rainy night air. The relentless spring downpour hit his face, but he didn't stop. He threw his upper body over the concrete lip, tumbling onto the thick mud of the Galena hillside. He didn't look back into the hole. He scrambled to his feet, running blindly through the torrential rain toward his utility truck, parked a quarter-mile away near the main access road. He dove into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and slammed the keys into the ignition, his body shaking so violently he could barely steer as he tore away from the abandoned mine site. The Joe Daviess County Sheriff's Department received Owen's panicked report at approximately 6:30 p.m. He was hyperventilating, his clothes covered in orange mine clay, and his hands were completely lacerated from the rusted ladder. The responding deputies, seeing the sheer state of shock on the young researcher's face, organized a tactical search team consisting of 4 armed officers and a mine safety expert to secure the location at dawn. When the team arrived at the Blackjack mine the following morning under a gray, overcast sky, the site was completely quiet. The rain had stopped, leaving the rolling hills heavy with mist. 2 deputies, armed with tactical shotguns and high-powered searchlights, descended the main air shaft to retrieve Owen's abandoned digital camera and inspect the 3rd level. When they reached the dead-end tunnel, they found Owen's lightweight tripod sitting in the mud. The aluminum legs had been completely bent and twisted into a tight metallic knot, and his waterproof backpack had been torn to shreds, its contents scattered across the floor. But what the state mining investigators discovered when they pulled the digital camera's memory card is what caused the entire site to be permanently condemned within 48 hours. The camera had captured a final automated exposure right before Owen dropped it. The image showed the vertical rock wall of the shaft looking straight down from a height of 20 feet. The gray, emaciated entity was caught perfectly by the infrared focus assist light, its long limbs splayed across the stone face, its upside-down head staring directly up into the lens. But when the image technicians magnified the dark background of the 3rd-level tunnel behind the creature, they realized they weren't looking at empty stone drifts. Slinking out from the deep, dark recesses of the old collapsed boulder pile were 4 other distinct gray silhouettes, their double-jointed limbs unfolding from the shadows, their glassy black eyes reflecting the infrared light like a cluster of predatory spiders. The mine wasn't a forgotten ruin, it was an active underground nest. The Illinois Department of Natural Resources permanently sealed the Blackjack Mine air shaft 3 weeks later. A construction crew blasted the upper concrete collar, collapsing the vertical shaft inward before pouring 50 tons of liquid industrial concrete over the opening, burying the entrance under a thick, permanent barrier. Owen Vance never finished his master's thesis, and he never entered an underground structure again. He sold his research equipment and relocated to a modern concrete slab home in the flat, arid plains of West Texas, a region with no old mines, no deep shafts, and absolutely no history. He managed to rebuild a quiet daytime routine, but the psychological scars of that rainy May afternoon remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to go near basements, he cannot tolerate dark, enclosed spaces, and he leaves a high-powered flashlight on his nightstand every single night. Because according to Owen, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's upside-down face. The true horror lives in the realization of what is sitting right beneath our feet every time he hears a faint, muffled vibration from the ground or watches a shadow shift near a vent. His body goes completely cold. He realizes that humanity is just walking on a thin, fragile crust of dirt, entirely unaware that deep within the ancient, forgotten foundations of the world, something impossible is breathing, chattering its teeth, and waiting for the next light to go out. The appeal of modern adventure vlogging is that it allows regular people to share the thrill of discovery in real time. When you strap a high-definition action camera to your chest and hike into the remote corners of the world, your audience gets to experience every breathtaking view and every sudden scare exactly as you do. It creates a powerful sense of connection, but it also records a permanent, unedited log of your reality. For 24-year-old content creator and backcountry hiker Caleb Cross, a solo video project in the rugged mountains of northern Arizona in the winter of 2018 would turn into a horrifying demonstration of this reality. He would discover that a digital camera doesn't just record memories. Sometimes it captures a living nightmare that lasts only 3 seconds, but changes your life forever. The setting for this story is the Coconino National Forest, a massive wilderness characterized by deep volcanic canyons, steep ponderosa pine ridges, and ancient limestone sinkholes. It was the 14th of November 2018, a day where a brutal winter freeze had pushed down from the peaks, dropping the temperature into the low 20s and leaving the forest floor covered in a crisp, icy layer of frost. The air was incredibly sharp, smelling of frozen pine sap, cold stone, and dead winter grass. Caleb was an experienced solo hiker who ran a moderately successful travel channel online. He was a practical, tech-savvy guy who viewed the forest as a backdrop for his creative work, completely devoid of any belief in urban legends or paranormal stories. He carried a heavy-duty tactical backpack, a top-of-the-line chest-mounted action camera, and a high-powered aluminum flashlight that could slice through the thickest darkness. Around 4:45 p.m., Caleb was exploring an unmapped basalt ravine about 5 miles away from the primary scenic overlook trail. The sun was dipping below the canyon rim, plunging the valley floor into a deep purple twilight that felt intensely heavy and quiet. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic crunch of his own hiking boots, fracturing the frozen pine needles, and the cold sound of his breathing. As he navigated a narrow, rocky ledge, Caleb noticed a dark fissure in the base of a vertical stone wall. The opening was about 4 feet wide, dropping straight down into a deep subterranean cavern chamber. Caleb felt a familiar surge of excitement, realizing this hidden cave would make excellent footage for his next video upload. He adjusted his chest camera, turned on his primary high-powered flashlight, and lowered himself through the gap, his boots sliding against the slick, frozen limestone until he reached the solid floor of the upper chamber exactly 20 feet below the surface. The air inside the cavern dropped instantly, turning bone-chillingly cold. The atmosphere was completely stagnant, heavy, and smelled sharply of copper, oxidized iron, and ancient rotting clay. For nearly 40 minutes, Caleb walked through the pristine stone passages, talking into his microphone and pointing his bright flashlight at the spectacular white mineral deposits on the walls. The blue-white beam cut through the heavy mist, creating a tiny circle of safety in the absolute dark. At exactly 5:32 p.m., Caleb reached a long, narrow gallery that resembled a forgotten subway tunnel. The floor was covered in smooth, dark river pebbles, and the passage tapered inward until it terminated in a solid wall of jagged limestone. Caleb walked to the very back of the gallery, stopping about 15 feet away from the terminal wall. He turned his body toward the center of the dark room, holding his flashlight up to illuminate the space, and began speaking his closing monologue to the camera lens. As he finished speaking, the high-powered aluminum flashlight in his hand suddenly flickered twice, its bright white beam dimming down to a pale, useless yellow glow before dying out completely, plunging the entire subway-like gallery into an absolute, suffocating darkness. Caleb stopped talking. The silence inside the cave became total, absolute, and physical, so heavy that he could hear the frantic rushing of the blood in his own ears. He didn't panic. He figured the cold winter air had simply drained the flashlight's lithium battery. He raised his hand to his chest, tapping the manual power switch on his action camera to activate its small built-in infrared night vision light, allowing him to see a faint, green-hued preview of the room on the small digital screen. As the camera sensor adjusted to the dark, the small preview screen rendered the green image of the terminal wall. Caleb's breath caught sharply in his throat. Crouching flat against the jagged limestone, fully caught in the center of the green camera display, was a shape. The anatomy was completely wrong. It was a towering skeletal entity, its body so emaciated that its ribs and elongated spine pushed sharply against its skin like jagged ridges. The flesh was a dull, leathery, bruised gray color, completely hairless, and glistened with a thick, clear fluid. Its double-jointed limbs were twice the length of a normal human's, its long arms ending in multi-jointed fingers with sharp black claws that were buried deep into the gravel floor. But it was the head that made Caleb's blood turn to ice. The creature's neck was long, thin, and twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle, causing its hairless head to hang completely upside down between its broad shoulders. It had no visible nose or ears, just a smooth, pale skull. But where the eyes should have been, the infrared sensor had caught the brilliant, blinding reflection of two massive, glassy black orbs. The creature was staring straight into the camera lens, its unhinged jaw wide open, revealing a series of jagged, calcified ridges running along its gums. Then, the digital timer on Caleb's camera screen ticked forward. Second one. The creature slowly shifted its weight, launching its 7-foot frame off the limestone wall, its long limbs propelling its body across the river pebbles with an insect-like velocity. Second 2. The entity closed the 15-foot distance instantly, its upside-down face filling the entire green frame of the camera display, its unhinged jaw twitching rapidly as a low, rapid, dry clicking noise, the chattering of bone against bone, burst from its throat. Second 3. The creature raised a long skeletal arm, its black claws snapping shut directly over the camera housing, and the small digital screen exploded into green static before going completely black. Caleb screamed, a raw sound of pure survival panic, and threw his upper body backward into the dark. The action camera was violently ripped from its chest harness, the fabric tearing away as the entity snatched the device into the absolute blackness. He did not try to find his flashlight, and he did not look for his gear bag. He turned on his heel and sprinted blindly down the narrow subway-like tunnel, his hiking boots skidding wildly over the smooth river pebbles. The gallery was a claustrophobic trap of pitch blackness. Caleb had to rely entirely on his hands, scraping his palms against the cold, wet limestone walls to maintain his balance as he ran. The air inside the passage had instantly turned hot and suffocating, thick with that sharp, copper-like stench of old rot and stagnant water that coated his throat with every frantic gasp. Behind him, from the terminal wall, the sound of the pursuit started. It was a heavy, fluid, four-legged scrambling that vibrated right through the stone floor. Thump, 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 thump. The entity was moving on all fours, its long, double-jointed limbs propelling its emaciated body across the rocks at an impossible speed, tracking the heavy sound of his boots. Caleb reached the base of the 20-foot drop where he had entered the cave system. The faint, dark purple twilight from the surface fissure filtered down, illuminating the vertical stone walls and the narrow opening above. He grabbed the jagged edges of the limestone wall, his fingers clawing at the frozen rock as he desperately tried to haul his body upward. His boots slipped against the slick stone, his fingernails splitting and bleeding as he fought for leverage. Below him, the rapid scrambling stopped. Caleb paused for a fraction of a second, looking straight down into the black abyss of the lower chamber. The creature was standing right at the base of the wall, its 7-foot frame fully silhouetted by the dim light from the surface. It slowly tilted its hairless skull back, its thin neck elongated and twisted at that horrific 90-degree angle. Its two massive, glassy black orbs locked onto his eyes, and its unhinged jaw slid open. Then, the creature opened its mouth wide, and a sound came out. It wasn't a gurgling hiss, and it wasn't the chattering of bone. It was Caleb's own voice, using the exact tone, pitch, and cadence of his closing video monologue, repeating his own words back to him in a dead mechanical loop. The sheer psychological terror of hearing his own voice coming out of that impossible mouth broke Caleb's paralysis. With a frantic, adrenaline-fueled cry, he threw his upper body forward, wedging his torso through the narrow surface fissure and clawed his way out onto the frozen ground of the basalt ravine. The freezing winter air hit his face, and the icy frost bit into his bleeding hands, but he didn't stop. He scrambled to his feet, running blindly through the dark ponderosa pines of the Coconino National Forest toward the primary access road 3 miles away. He dove into the front seat of his parked utility truck, slammed the door locks down, and tore away from the canyon rim, his hands shaking so violently he could barely keep the vehicle on the road. The Coconino County Sheriff's Office received Caleb's panicked report at approximately 7:15 p.m. He was hyperventilating, his clothes torn to shreds, and his face was completely devoid of color. The responding deputies, seeing the profound state of shock on the young content creator's face, organized a search and rescue team consisting of 4 armed officers and a forest ranger to secure the ravine at dawn. When the team arrived at the hidden fissure the following morning under a clear, freezing sky, the forest was completely quiet. The winter sun illuminated the basalt rocks, casting long, sharp shadows across the ravine. 2 deputies, armed with tactical shotguns and high-powered searchlights, lowered themselves into the sinkhole to retrieve Caleb's gear and inspect the cave. When they reached the terminal gallery, they found Caleb's tactical backpack sitting on the river pebbles, completely untouched. His action camera was lying 20 feet away near the back wall, its heavy-duty plastic housing cracked open, and its internal battery completely drained. But what the cyber forensics team discovered when they retrieved the camera's memory card back at the flagship station in Flagstaff is what caused the entire file to be placed under an immediate federal classification order. The memory card was fully intact. When the technicians developed the final video file, the clip lasted exactly 3 seconds before cutting to black. The footage showed the gray, emaciated entity launching itself off the limestone wall, its upside-down face filling the entire green frame of the infrared sensor. But when the digital analysts processed the audio track of those 3 seconds, running the sound through a high-definition filter, they discovered that beneath the loud clicking of the creature's teeth, the microphone had picked up a secondary, low-frequency signal. The signal wasn't a natural acoustic echo. It was a digital encryption sequence that had targeted the camera's wireless receiver, broadcasting a short, repeating line of data that translated into a precise set of GPS coordinates. The coordinates didn't point to the cave in Arizona. They pointed directly to the residential address of Caleb's parents' home in suburban Ohio, meaning the entity hadn't just attacked his camera, it had used the device's own network link to trace his identity back to the surface. The National Park authorities permanently closed the basalt ravine 3 weeks later. A specialized engineering crew used heavy machinery to pour tons of solid industrial concrete into the surface fissure, completely blocking the entrance and burying the cave beneath a permanent barrier of rock and cement. Caleb Cross never uploaded another video to his travel channel, and he never entered a forest again. He deleted his online accounts, sold his camera equipment, and relocated to a modern concrete high-rise apartment complex in downtown Miami, Florida, a place where the ground is covered in miles of solid asphalt, the buildings are constructed of steel and glass, and the artificial lights of the city never turn off. He managed to build a quiet, routine life as a digital graphic designer, but the psychological scars of that November afternoon remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to go near dark spaces, he cannot tolerate quiet rooms, and he leaves a high-powered lantern burning on his desk 24 hours a day. Because according to Caleb, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's black orbs. The true horror lives in the knowledge of how connected the dark truly is. Every time he sees a digital screen flicker or hears a faint, rhythmic chattering sound from a ventilation shaft in his office, his entire body goes completely cold. He realizes that humanity is just living in a tiny circle of modern technology, entirely unaware that just outside the edge of our lights, something impossible is watching through the screen, learning our secrets, and waiting for the signal to drop. The human body is an incredibly resilient machine, but it has some very hard, non-negotiable limits. If you subject it to extreme cold, you have a very predictable window of time before hypothermia sets in, your core temperature drops, and your vital organs simply decide to turn off. When you choose to go ice fishing in the dead of winter in the northern United States, you understand this risk. You dress in heavy layers, you bring a heated shanty, and you constantly monitor the thickness of the ice beneath your boots. But for 24-year-old landscape photographer Garrett Cole, a solo trip to a frozen lake in northern Minnesota in the winter of 2021 would throw him into a situation where the cold wasn't his only enemy. He would find out that the ice doesn't just keep the water down, sometimes it traps something else entirely. The setting for the story is Lake Vermilion, a massive, deep body of water located in a remote part of St. Louis County, Minnesota. It was the 14th of January, 2021. A day where a brutal Arctic blast had pushed down from Canada, dropping the temperature to a bone-chilling -15 degrees. The wind was howling across the flat expanse of the frozen lake, creating blinding flurries of whiteout snow that completely erased the tree line on the shore. Garrett was an experienced winter outdoorsman. He had driven his four-wheel drive pickup truck out onto the ice earlier that afternoon, parking near a deep trench where he knew the winter pike liked to congregate. He had spent the last 2 hours drilling an 8-inch hole through the 20 inches of solid blue ice, setting up his portable insulated pop-up shelter, and turning on a small propane heater to keep the interior space livable. By 6:30 p.m., the winter darkness had fully arrived. The world outside his nylon shelter was an absolute freezing void, dominated only by the roaring wind. Inside, the amber glow of a battery-powered lantern cast long, flickering shadows against the fabric walls. Garrett sat on a folding bucket seat, staring down into the dark, circular hole in the center of the ice, watching his fishing line dangle into the black water below. The contrast was hypnotic, a small circle of liquid water surrounded by a frozen desert. At exactly 6:52 p.m., the propane heater let out a sharp sputter and died. Garrett cursed softly, his breath instantly forming a thick white cloud in the sudden chill. He reached down to check the gas valve, but before his fingers could touch the metal regulator, he heard a sound. It didn't come from the wind outside, and it didn't come from his truck. It came from directly beneath him, inside the ice itself. It was a heavy, dull thud. Thump. Elijah froze. In the winter, frozen lakes make a lot of noise. As the temperature drops, the ice expands and contracts, creating massive, booming cracks that sound like cannon fire echoing across the water. It is a completely normal, albeit unsettling, phenomenon. Garrett expected to hear the familiar, laser-like ricochet sound of a pressure crack traveling across the lake. But this wasn't a crack. 3 seconds later, the sound happened again right at the edge of his ice hole. Thump, thump. It sounded exactly like something heavy and solid striking the underside of the 20-inch ice shelf from the water below. Garrett stood up, pulling his heavy gloves on, and grabbed his powerful tactical flashlight. He approached the edge of the hole, bending over slightly, and shined the bright white beam straight down into the water. The light penetrated the first few feet, illuminating the suspended particles of organic matter floating in the current before fading into the deep, black abyss of the lake. The water was perfectly still. Garrett shook his head, thinking a massive lake sturgeon or an oversized northern pike had simply swum up to investigate his bait and bumped into the ice. He turned away to grab his spare propane tank from the corner of the tent. As his back was turned, a sudden violent spray of freezing water erupted from the hole, splashing against the back of his heavy canvas jacket. Garrett spun around, his heart instantly hammering against his ribs. The water inside the 8-inch hole was sloshing back and forth erratically, overflowing onto the slushy ice floor of the shelter. But there was no fish on his line. The line was completely slack. Then, Garrett noticed a change in the ice surrounding the hole. The blue, solid ice had a slight transparency to it when illuminated by his lantern. And right beneath the surface, about 3 inches down into the frozen shelf, was a dark shape. Garrett dropped to his knees, pressing the lens of his tactical flashlight flat against the ice to cut through the surface glare. The white light illuminated the interior of the frozen block. Moving slowly through the solid ice, just inches beneath Garrett's knees, was a hand. It wasn't a human hand. The fingers were immeasurably long, thin, and skeletal, with gray, leathery flesh that looked completely waterlogged. The nails were pointed and black, scraping against the frozen interior with a faint, muffled ticking sound that resonated through the floor. Tick, tick, tick. Garrett let out a breathless gasp, scrambling backward until his spine hit the vertical support poles of his shelter. His mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. The hand was inside the ice. Not in the water beneath it, but actually embedded within the frozen molecular structure, moving through the solid mass as if it were swimming through thick mud. The dark shape moved with a sickening fluid grace, traveling in a circle around the perimeter of the fishing hole. Garrett realized with absolute certainty that whatever this thing was, it was using its claws to score the underside of the ice, systematically weakening the shelf directly beneath his folding chair. Before he could even reach for the zipper of the tent door, the ice beneath his shelter let out a horrific, splintering scream. A massive starburst fracture ripped through the center of the floor. The 8-inch fishing hole instantly collapsed outward, expanding into a jagged 3-foot chasm of black water. The sudden shift in weight caused Garrett's folding bucket seat, his tackle box, and his lantern to slide into the hole, vanishing into the lake with a heavy splash. The shelter tilted violently to the left, the nylon fabric tearing away from the frozen anchors in the wind. Garrett lunged forward, his gloved hands clawing at the slippery edge of the intact ice shelf as his legs dangled into the freezing 40-degree water below. The cold hit his lower body like an electric shock, instantly paralyzing his thigh muscles and stealing the air from his lungs. He struggled to pull himself up, his heavy winter boots filling with water, dragging him down like anchors. As he kicked his legs frantically in the dark water, trying to find a purchase against the submerged wall of the ice shelf, something brushed against his right ankle. It was a firm, freezing grip. A set of long, skeletal fingers closed tightly around his boot, pulling downward with an immense, steady pressure. Garrett screamed into the empty tent, his fingers slipping against the wet, slushy surface of the lake ice as he was dragged an inch lower into the black water. He reached out with his right hand, his fingers scrambling in the dark until they closed around the handle of his metal ice chisel, a heavy, 3-foot steel bar with a razor-sharp edge used to clear ice from the hole. Garrett hoisted the heavy iron bar with his remaining strength and drove the sharp tip straight down into the water near his legs. The metal struck something solid. A muffled, high-pitched screech echoed through the water, vibrating right through the soles of his boots. The freezing grip on his ankle instantly released. Garrett didn't wait. He threw his upper body onto the solid ice shelf, crawling on his belly like a seal, hauling his waterlogged legs out of the chasm just as the entire pop-up shelter collapsed into the hole behind him. He lay on the open ice, fully exposed to the -15-degree wind, his clothes instantly freezing into a stiff, solid armor of ice. He was completely blind in the dark, his lantern gone, the whiteout snow stinging his eyes. About 50 feet away, the headlights of his pickup truck were still cutting through the blizzard, representing his only chance at survival. Garrett attempted to stand, but his legs were completely numb from the thermal shock. He began to drag his body across the frozen expanse, using his elbows to pull himself through the snowdrifts toward the truck. Behind him, from the dark chasm where his tent had been, came the sound of something heavy dragging itself out of the water onto the surface of the lake. It was a wet, rhythmic, slapping sound against the solid ice. Slap, drag, slap, drag. The sound wasn't staying by the hole. It was moving through the blizzard, tracking the line of Garrett's scent in the snow, accelerating with every passing second. The wet, rhythmic, slapping sound against the solid ice was closing the distance fast. Slap, drag, slap, drag. Through the roar of the -15-degree wind, Garrett could hear a low, rattling click, like frozen teeth chattering together at an impossible speed. He didn't look back. Looking back would mean slowing down, and a delay of even a single second meant death. He dragged his frozen, heavy body forward, his elbows scraping raw against the crusted snow, his eyes locked entirely on the twin beams of his truck's headlights, cutting through the whiteout blizzard. He reached the driver's side door, his fingers completely stiff and losing all sensation from the advanced stage of frostbite, fumbled brutally with the frozen door handle. He pulled it with everything he had left, and the heavy metal door swung open, casting a warm, interior yellow glow over the snow. Garrett rolled his body over the threshold into the cab, collapsing onto the floorboards before hauling his leaden legs inside. He slammed the door shut, hit the power locks, and shoved the keys, which were thankfully already in the ignition, forward. The V8 engine roared to life, the heater instantly blowing a faint wisp of lukewarm air into the cabin. Garrett pulled himself up onto the bench seat, his entire body shaking so violently he could barely look straight ahead. He wiped the frost from his eyes and looked out the driver's side window into the blinding sheet of snow. Standing just 5 feet away from the truck, directly in the path of the headlights, was the entity. In the sharp, blue-white glare of the high beams, Garrett could see it with terrifying clarity. It was nearly 7 feet tall, its gray, leathery torso so emaciated that its spine pushed sharply against the skin of its back. It had no clothes, no hair, and its long, multi-jointed limbs were dripping with black, freezing lake water that turned into instant icicles as it hit the air. Its head was elongated, featuring no nose or ears, and its face was dominated by 2 massive, glassy black orbs that completely absorbed the truck's headlights. Its unhinged jaw was wide open, revealing those same jagged, calcified ridges Garrett had felt through the ice, twitching rapidly from side to side to create that horrific clicking sound. The creature didn't attack the vehicle. It slowly raised one of its long, skeletal arms, its black, pointed claws scraping gently against the driver's side glass pane. Screech. Then, it tilted its head at an impossible angle, its black eyes locking directly onto Garrett through the glass, and it let out a low, wet, gurgling hiss that vibrated right through the metal frame of the truck. Garrett, consumed by pure, unadulterated survival panic, slammed his foot down onto the gas pedal. The 4-wheel drive tires spun violently against the thick ice, screaming for traction before the studded rubber finally bit into the snow. The pickup truck lunged forward, swerving erratically across the frozen expanse of Lake Vermilion. Garrett didn't follow the ice road, he just drove blindly toward the faint, distant lights of the shoreline highway, terrifyingly aware that the creature had vanished into the blizzard behind him. He reached the boat launch ramp 20 minutes later, his truck bouncing violently over the frozen shoreline rocks before hitting the safety of the salted asphalt of Route 77. He drove straight to the nearest emergency room in Virginia, Minnesota, where he was immediately admitted for severe hypothermia and advanced stage 2 frostbite on his feet and fingers. The St. Louis County Sheriff's Department launched a full investigation into the incident the following afternoon after Garrett was stabilized. A team of 3 deputies, accompanied by a local wildlife officer, drove out onto the ice to locate Garrett's abandoned equipment and assess the site of the ice collapse. When they located the coordinates of the starburst fracture, they found the portable shelter completely submerged inside the 3-foot chasm of black water, frozen solid into the ice shelf as the temperature had dropped overnight. But what the deputies found on the surface of the ice surrounding the chasm is what turned this file into an absolute psychological horror. There were no human footprints in the snow other than the deep troughs left by Garrett's elbows as he dragged himself to his truck. However, spanning a 300-foot radius around the open water, the ice was covered in hundreds of the long, 5-fingered skeletal claw marks. The marks didn't just lead away from the hole toward the truck. When the wildlife officer used a high-powered ice-penetrating radar to map the structure of the frozen shelf beneath the snow, he discovered that the entire 20-inch layer of ice for 50 yards around Garrett's fishing spot had been systematically hollowed out from below. Something had spent weeks using its claws to carve a massive subterranean network of horizontal tunnels inside the solid ice shelf channels that were just wide enough for an emaciated, leathery body to swim through, hidden completely from the view of anyone standing on the surface. This meant that the entity hadn't just chanced upon Garrett's fishing hole that evening. It had been living inside the ice shelf itself for months, moving silently beneath the feet of dozens of winter fishermen, listening to the vibrations of the augers, and waiting for someone to sit alone in the dark after the sun went down. Despite an extensive sweep of the lake by state conservation officers over the next 2 winters, the entity was never seen again. The case remains an open, unsolved mystery in the St. Tep Tess. Louis County Archives categorized officially as an unexplained ice hazard and structural failure. Garrett Cole spent 3 weeks in the hospital, narrowly avoiding the amputation of his toes. He sold his landscape photography business, sold his truck, and left the state of Minnesota entirely within a month of his release. He relocated to a small town in the high, arid desert of New Mexico, where the ground is baked dry by the sun and water is a luxury found only in pipes. He managed to build a new life, but the psychological residue of that Arctic night has never left him. He refuses to travel north during the winter, he won't enter a cold room, and he uses only hot, running water for any daily activity. Because according to Garrett, the true nightmare isn't the memory of the freezing water or the creature's black eyes. The true nightmare lives in the knowledge of what lies beneath the surface of things. Every time he walks across a wooden floor or a tiled room, his body tenses up. His ears listen intently for the faint, muffled sound of something clicking against the supports from below, and he realizes that you can be completely safe, walking through your life with absolute confidence, entirely unaware that just 3 inches beneath your feet, something is waiting for the ice to break. The environment of a large metropolitan hospital at 3 o'clock in the morning is a very specific kind of quiet. The bustling energy of the daytime shifts has completely cleared out, leaving the long, polished hallways bathed in a dim, fluorescent hum. The air inside smells sharply of rubbing alcohol, bleached linens, and that cold, sterile ventilation air that seems to dry out your throat within minutes. For 35-year-old night shift radiology technician Austin Vance, working the graveyard rotation at a major medical center in Denver, Colorado, in the winter of 2021 was supposed to be just another predictable shift of processing broken bones and routine chest scans. But on the night of the 14th of December 2021, a patient would walk through the doors of the emergency room who would completely shatter Austin's understanding of human biology. He would discover that a standard medical image meant to diagnose a simple injury could capture a secret so terrifying that it would force an entire hospital floor into an immediate federal lockdown. The patient was a 32-year-old backcountry skier named Garrett Vance, who had been brought in by a friend after getting lost for several hours in a remote, unmapped valley near the Arapahoe National Forest. Garrett was a practical, athletic guy who looked at the natural world through a lens of strict logic and sport. He had arrived at the emergency room complaining of a deep, dull ache in his central rib cage, claiming he had taken a hard fall into a deep limestone fissure hidden beneath the snow. Austin was a highly disciplined professional who had processed thousands of scans over his 10-year career. He was a thoroughly data-driven individual who viewed the human body as a predictable machine, completely devoid of any belief in medical anomalies or unexplainable phenomena. Around 3:15 a.m., Austin wheeled Garrett into the cold, heavily shielded radiology suite to take a standard 3-view chest X-ray. The atmosphere inside the scanning room was intensely quiet, broken only by the low, mechanical whine of the massive X-ray tube positioning itself above the leather examination table. Austin stepped behind the heavy lead glass viewing partition, instructed Garrett to hold his breath, and pressed the primary exposure button. The machine emitted a short, sharp buzz as the radiation passed through Garrett's chest, capturing the internal structures on the digital receptor below. As the high-resolution digital image rendered onto Austin's primary viewing monitor, the breath completely caught in his throat. The skeletal structure on the screen was perfectly sharp, but the anatomy was completely wrong. Garrett's lungs and heart were visible, but his central ribcage had been entirely replaced by a series of jagged, calcified vertical ridges, that resembled interlocking stone teeth. Pushing sharply against his spine was an elongated, segmented secondary skeletal column that extended upward toward his collarbone, looking less like a human backbone and more like the rigid exoskeleton of a massive predatory insect. But it was the upper section of the image that made Austin's heart give a violent, uncomfortable thud against his ribs. The X-ray showed a long, thin, secondary muscular structure that was tightly wrapped around Garrett's primary windpipe, extending directly into his throat. And hiding right behind his collarbone, completely integrated into his flesh, were two massive, dense, perfectly circular organic spheres that completely absorbed the radiation, showing up on the monitor as two solid, glassy black orbs. Austin stood perfectly paralyzed behind the lead glass, his hands trembling so violently he could barely hold his digital stylus, his logical brain completely fractured. He looked through the viewing window at Garrett, who was sitting quietly on the edge of the examination table, casually adjusting his hospital gown as if nothing was wrong. Austin slowly keyed the internal intercom microphone, his voice cracking with pure adrenaline, asking Garrett if he had ever undergone any major reconstructive surgeries or spinal fusions. Garrett did not answer the question. He slowly turned his head toward the lead glass window. The movement was unnatural. His neck didn't turn with a smooth human rotation. It elongated slightly, twisting at a horrific 70-degree angle with a succession of sharp, dry, audible biological cracks that echoed through the quiet room. Then Garrett opened his mouth wide. From deep within his throat, picking up with terrifying clarity on the room's high-sensitivity intercom microphone, came a sound. It wasn't a voice, and it wasn't a gasp for air. It was a sharp, dry, rapid clicking noise, the rhythmic chattering of bone against bone at an impossible velocity. Click, 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 click. And as Austin watched in absolute, unadulterated horror, Garrett's pupils completely dilated, his eyes transforming into two massive, glassy black orbs that perfectly reflected the pale blue light of the monitor screens. He shifted his weight, launching his body off the examination table onto all fours, his long, double-jointed limbs moving with a fluid, spider-like speed as he headed straight for the heavy security door separating the suite. Austin reacted out of pure, base survival instinct. He lunged across the desk and slammed his hand onto the emergency manual lockdown button on the wall panel. The heavy, lead-lined security door slid shut with a loud mechanical hiss, the steel deadbolts locking into the frame just a fraction of a second before Garrett's body slammed into the glass window. The impact was so violent that the reinforced lead glass webbed with a network of fine cracks. Garrett was no longer moving like a man. He was compressed flat against the other side of the glass, his long, double-jointed limbs splayed out like a predatory insect. Through the cracked partition, Austin could see the creature's gray, leathery torso pulsing rapidly beneath the torn hospital gown, and its thin neck remained twisted at that horrific angle. It brought its hands up against the glass, its fingernails completely gone, replaced by thick, black, calcified claws that began to scrape against the reinforced window with a slow, agonizing shriek. Screech. Then, the intercom speaker on Austin's desk crackled to life again. The creature didn't use a human voice. Instead, it used the high-sensitivity microphone to blast that dry, rapid chattering of bone against bone directly into the control booth. Click, 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 click. The frequency of the sound was immense, vibrating so intensely through the electronic equipment that Austin's computer monitors began to flicker violently, their displays distorting into bands of green static. Austin staggered backward, covering his ears, as his nose began to bleed from the sheer concussive pressure of the acoustic wave. He didn't wait for the glass to shatter. He turned and threw open the rear exit door of the radiology booth, sprinting out into the long, dark corridor of the hospital's lower level. He did not call for the elevator. He ran straight for the emergency stairwell, his sneakers slapping loudly against the polished linoleum floors as he fled toward the security office on the main floor. The Denver Police Department and a specialized federal medical response unit arrived at the hospital at approximately 3:45 a.m., placing the entire wing under an immediate tactical quarantine. The on-duty staff were restricted to their stations, and all entrance gates were locked down with heavy-duty security chains. When the heavily armed tactical team entered the radiology suite with high-powered searchlights and ballistic shields, the room was completely quiet. The cold, sterile air smelled intensely of copper, ozone, and a thick, sulfur-like chemical rot. Garrett Vance was completely gone. The heavy lead-lined security door had been violently buckled outward from the inside, the steel deadbolts sheared cleanly off their mountings. The leather examination table had been torn to shreds, and the massive X-ray tube above it was shattered, its heavy components twisted like wire. But what the federal forensics teams discovered when they analyzed the structural architecture of the radiology suite is what caused the entire hospital basement to be permanently encased in concrete within 48 hours. The creature hadn't escaped through the hospital hallways or the public doors. The investigators found a jagged, 2-foot-wide hole ripped directly through the reinforced concrete floor beneath the examination table, cutting straight into the heavy-duty industrial ventilation and utility shafts that ran vertically through the building's foundations. And when the technicians lowered an inspection camera deep into the darkness of the shaft, they discovered that the internal concrete walls of the hospital's primary infrastructure were completely covered in thousands of the long, 5-fingered claw marks. The entity hadn't just materialized in the mountains that winter. It had been utilizing the deep, unmapped utility labyrinths beneath the city's modern medical centers for years, traveling through the subterranean concrete veins completely undetected, living right beneath the feet of thousands of patients and doctors. Furthermore, when the scientists analyzed the digital backup of the X-ray on Austin's terminal, they realized the secondary skeletal column inside Garrett's body wasn't a biological growth. The density analysis showed that the stone-like ridges were designed to absorb extreme environmental pressure, meaning the entity was naturally built to survive at depths miles beneath the Earth's crust, and it was slowly adapting its biology to walk among humanity on the surface. The hospital administration permanently condemned the lower radiology wing 3 weeks after the incident. A specialized engineering crew used industrial cement mixers to fill the entire basement level with 80 tons of liquid concrete, sealing the utility shafts and erasing the suite from the facility's blueprints. Austin Vance never processed another medical scan, and he never entered a hospital again. He resigned from his radiology career, sold his home in Colorado, and relocated to a small, single-story ranch house in the flat, sun-baked desert of eastern New Mexico, a place with no basements, no complex building infrastructures, and absolutely no underground utility networks. He managed to build a quiet, daytime routine as a local delivery driver, but the psychological scars of that December night remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to go near any large corporate buildings, he cannot tolerate dark, enclosed spaces, and he keeps a high-powered tactical lantern burning in his bedroom every single night. Because, according to Austin, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's black, glassy eyes. The true horror lives in the realization of what is walking right next to us. Every time he sees someone tilt their head slightly or hears a faint, rhythmic clicking sound from an air conditioning vent in a grocery store, his entire body goes completely cold. He realizes that humanity is just living in a fragile illusion of health and safety, entirely unaware that deep within the solid, modern structures of our world, something impossible is breathing, chattering its teeth, and waiting for the next scan to begin. The appeal of amateur spelunking, or cave exploring, is that it allows regular people to become true pioneers. In a world where almost every square inch of the surface has been mapped by satellites, the deep underground remains one of the last places on Earth where you can step into a room where no human eye has ever looked before. But for 29-year-old high school biology teacher Brandon Cole, a weekend trip into the rugged wilderness of eastern Kentucky in the spring of 2022 would turn into a stark reminder of why some spaces were left unmapped. He would discover that being the first person to enter a cave doesn't mean you are the only thing inside it. The setting for this story is the Daniel Boone National Forest, a massive expanse of dense woods, steep sandstone cliffs, and thousands of hidden limestone sinkholes. It was the 23rd of April 2022, a damp, foggy Saturday where the spring rain had finally stopped. But the forest floor remained soaked, smelling heavily of wet moss, decaying leaves, and cold mud. Brandon was not a reckless adventurer. He was a methodical, careful guy who spent his free time documenting wild orchid species and mapping minor cave entrances for a local conservation group. He was incredibly fit, carried top-of-the-line gear, and always let the local ranger station know his general coordinates before heading out. Around 1:30 p.m., Brandon was navigating a steep, rocky ravine about 4 miles off the main hiking trail when he noticed a strange anomaly in the hillside. Hidden behind a thick curtain of tangled wild blackberry briars and overgrown ferns was a narrow horizontal fissure in the limestone rock. The opening was only about 3 feet wide, but a steady, surprisingly cold blast of air was blowing out from the darkness inside, indicating that the fissure connected to a substantial underground chamber. Brandon felt that familiar surge of excitement. He pulled out his rugged digital camera, turned on his primary high-powered headlamp, and dropped to his knees. He slid his backpack ahead of him, maneuvering his torso through the tight, muddy gap. The rock was sharp, tearing at his canvas jacket, but after a few yards of tight crawling, the ceiling suddenly vaulted upward. He stood up, brushing the wet clay from his knees, and shined his light around. He was standing in a majestic, pristine limestone cavern that dropped down at a sharp angle. The air was dead, heavy, and incredibly crisp, registering at a constant 55 degrees. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic ping of water droplets falling from distant stalactites and hitting the stone floor somewhere in the dark. For the next 2 hours, Brandon moved deeper into the cave system, completely fascinated. He followed a dry, ancient underground riverbed that twisted and turned through 3 massive chambers, each one larger than the last. He took dozens of high-definition photos of rare geological formations, his camera flash exploding with brilliant bursts of white light that briefly illuminated the ancient stone walls before plunging them back into the blue-white beam of his headlamp. At exactly 3:42 p.m., Brandon reached what appeared to be the absolute end of the cave system. He entered a long, narrow gallery that resembled a subway tunnel. The floor was covered in smooth, dark river pebbles, and the walls tapered inward until they terminated in a solid, vertical wall of jagged limestone. Brandon walked to the very back of the gallery, stopping about 10 feet away from the terminal wall. He set his backpack down on the pebbles, pulled out a fresh bottle of water, and decided to take one final panoramic photograph of the room before starting the long trek back to the surface. He raised his heavy DSLR camera to his eye, dialed the shutter speed down to allow for a long exposure, and pressed the button. The powerful external strobe flash mounted on top of the camera popped with a deafening electric crack, illuminating the entire back wall of the cave with a light as bright as the midday sun. The light vanished instantly, returning the room to the narrow beam of his headlamp. Brandon smiled, looking down at the small LCD preview screen on the back of his camera to check the exposure of the shot. As the digital image rendered on the screen, Brandon's breath caught sharply in his throat. The photograph was crystal clear. It showed the smooth pebble floor, the dark limestone walls, and the vertical rock face at the dead end. But standing precisely in the far left corner of the terminal wall, completely hidden within a deep shadow that his headlamp had missed, was a shape. It wasn't a rock formation. The geometry was entirely wrong. It was a towering, skeletal figure, standing well over 6.5 feet tall. The entity was completely naked, its skin a dull, bruised gray color that looked slick, oily, and completely hairless. It was pressed tight into the corner, its long, emaciated limbs folded inward against its torso like a compressed insect. But what made Brandon's blood run completely cold was its posture. The creature's neck was unnaturally elongated, its head tilted downward at a horrific 90-degree angle, staring directly across the empty room toward the camera lens. It had no visible nose or ears, just a smooth, pale skull. But where the eyes should have been, the camera flash had caught the distinct white reflection of two massive glassy orbs. Brandon stood perfectly paralyzed in the silent gallery, the small screen of the camera illuminating his face in a pale blue glow. His logical mind tried to reject it. He told himself it was an optical illusion, a strange combination of iron deposits and shadows on the limestone wall. He slowly raised his head, his hands shaking violently as he directed the bright blue-white beam of his headlamp toward the far left corner of the back wall. The corner was empty. There was nothing but jagged gray stone and a small pool of shadow. Brandon let out a ragged, trembling breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He reached down to pick up his water bottle, his eyes still fixed on the empty corner. Then, the dead silence of the subterranean gallery was broken by a sound. It didn't come from the ceiling, and it didn't come from the tunnel behind him. It came from directly inside the solid limestone wall in the back of the cave. It was a low, dry, rhythmic scraping sound, like heavy bone dragging slowly across rough concrete. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. And as Brandon watched in absolute, unadulterated horror, a narrow vertical crack in the stone wall, a fissure that was barely 4 inches wide, began to flex. The solid limestone groaned under an immense, impossible pressure, and a long, pale, multi-jointed finger, ending in a sharp black claw, slowly pushed out from the darkness inside the mountain. The single, pale finger hooked around the edge of the narrow rock crack, its black claw digging into the soft limestone with enough force to send a small shower of white stone dust clattering down onto the river pebbles below. Brandon could not look away. The sheer, overwhelming terror felt like a physical weight crushing his chest, freezing the air inside his lungs. He stood completely still, his headlamp trembling so badly that the beam of light danced erratically across the back wall of the cave, while his brain desperately tried to process the physical impossibility of what he was witnessing. A 4-inch crack in solid stone cannot accommodate a living creature. But then the limestone groaned again, a deep, vibrating bass sound that resonated right through the soles of Brandon's boots. A second finger emerged, then a third. The long, multi-jointed hands began to pull the edges of the vertical fissure apart. The rock wasn't breaking, it was flexing, shifting like clay under an immense, unnatural pressure from the other side. Slowly, the smooth, hairless crown of a pale gray skull began to push through the gap. The skin was slick and wet, glistening under the blue-white beam of the headlamp, completely free of any blood or tissue, despite the razor-sharp edges of the stone scraping against it. The entity was unhinging its own skeletal structure, compressing its ribs and shoulders flat to slip through a space no wider than a book. As the top half of the creature's face cleared the rock, its two massive, glassy black orbs snapped into focus. They didn't blink. They didn't adjust to the bright light. They locked instantly onto Brandon, absorbing the headlamp's glare like twin pools of ink. Its unhinged jaw slid open, and from deep within its elongated throat came a low, wet, rhythmic chattering sound, the dry clicking of bone rubbing against bone. The clicking sound echoed off the narrow walls of the gallery, magnifying until it sounded like hundreds of insects crawling inside Brandon's own ears. That sound broke Brandon's paralysis. He didn't grab his backpack. He didn't check his water bottle. He spun around on his heel, his heavy boots skidding wildly against the smooth river pebbles, and bolted down the narrow subway-like tunnel, running blindly back toward the mouth of the cave. The gallery was pitch black behind him, illuminated only by the frantic, bouncing beam of his headlamp as he ran. He sprinted through the first massive chamber, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The air in the cave, which had felt crisp and refreshing hours earlier, now felt suffocating, smelling heavily of ancient, stagnant mud and iron. Behind him, from the darkness of the tunnel he had just abandoned, came a terrifyingly fast sound. It wasn't a running stride. It was a heavy, four-legged scrambling, a rapid succession of wet, solid impacts against the stone floor. Thump, 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 thump. The entity was moving with an insect-like velocity, its long, double-jointed limbs propelling its emaciated body across the rocks at a speed no human could ever match. Brandon reached the steep, rocky slope that led to the second chamber. He scrambled up the loose stones on his hands and knees, tearing his fingernails against the rock, his headlamp swinging wildly. He looked over his shoulder for a fraction of a second. At the bottom of the slope, just 30 feet behind him, the blue-white light caught the towering gray silhouette. It was moving on all fours, its head hanging upside down from its elongated neck, its black eyes reflecting the light with a brilliant, predatory shine. The clicking sound from its throat was deafening now, vibrating through the solid stone walls of the cavern. Brandon screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated survival panic, and threw his body forward through a narrow archway leading to the final chamber. He knew the entrance fissure was just ahead, but he also knew the entry track required a slow, tight crawl on his stomach. If he tried to crawl, the creature would catch him before his torso even cleared the gap. He reached the base of the final limestone wall, where the horizontal fissure sat hidden behind the ferns. The cold outside air was blowing inward, smelling of fresh rain and forest earth. Brandon didn't slide into the crawlway. Instead, he grabbed his heavy digital camera, which was still securely strapped around his neck, and turned around to face the dark archway. The creature burst into the chamber, its long arms reaching out, its black claws outstretched. Brandon raised the camera, targeted the center of the dark room, and slammed his finger down on the shutter button. The high-powered external strobe flash exploded with a brilliant, blinding pop of white light, completely illuminating every single corner of the limestone cavern with the intensity of a lightning strike. The creature let out a high-pitched, metallic shriek, a sound like tearing sheet metal as the sudden, intense light hit its dilated black eyes. It recoiled violently, its long limbs buckling underneath its weight as it threw its torso backward into the shadows of the rocks to escape the glare. Brandon didn't wait for the flash to recharge. He dropped the camera, threw his body flat into the mud of the fissure, and clawed his way through the narrow opening with a frantic, desperate strength. The sharp limestone tore through his jacket and cut deep lines into his back, but he didn't stop until his head burst through the curtain of wild blackberry briars into the foggy afternoon air of the forest. He tumbled out onto the wet dirt of the ravine, scrambled to his feet, and ran blindly through the dense woods of the Daniel Boone National Forest, leaving his gear, his camera, and the cave behind him forever. 3 hours later, a search and rescue team found Brandon sitting on the shoulder of a remote logging road, covered in wet clay, his clothes torn to shreds, and his back bleeding from dozens of deep lacerations. He was shivering violently despite the mild spring air, staring blankly into the trees, completely unable to speak. The local ranger station, working alongside the Kentucky State Police, dispatched a team of 5 armed deputies to locate the coordinates of the undocumented cave the following morning. Because Brandon had left his GPS tracker inside his backpack at the terminal wall, the team was able to navigate straight to the hidden fissure in the ravine. When the deputies breached the narrow opening and moved through the subterranean chambers, they found the cave completely silent. The dry riverbed was empty, and Brandon's backpack was still sitting on the river pebbles at the very back of the gallery, untouched. But what the forensics team discovered when they retrieved Brandon's dropped digital camera near the entrance is what turned this case into a classified federal file. The camera's internal memory card was completely intact. When the technicians developed the final image, the one Brandon had taken right before escaping into the crawlway, the photograph showed the entire final chamber lit up by the strobe flash. The gray, emaciated creature was caught perfectly in the center of the frame, its torso twisting backward, its long fingers shielding its hairless skull from the light. But the photograph also revealed something the headlamp had completely missed. The creature hadn't emerged from the rock alone. In the brilliant white light of the flash, the walls of the final chamber were shown to be covered in dozens of small vertical fissures. And from inside every single one of those dark cracks, a pair of long, pale fingers was slowly reaching out into the room, meaning the mountain wasn't just holding one entity, the entire cave system was a living hive. The Daniel Boone National Forest authorities permanently sealed the entrance to the fissure 3 days later, pouring tons of solid industrial concrete into the ravine to block the gap completely. The cave was erased from all local conservation maps, and the file was handed over to a federal agency, remaining closed to the public to this day. Brandon Cole never returned to teaching biology, and he never entered the state of Kentucky again. He relocated to a high-rise apartment building in downtown Manhattan, choosing a space on the 40th floor where the ground is a distant memory and everything is constructed of steel, glass, and solid concrete. He managed to rebuild a quiet routine, but the psychological scars of that spring afternoon have never left him. He refuses to visit parks, he cannot sleep in a dark room, and he uses a high-powered flashlight for any nightly activity. Because according to Brandon, the true nightmare isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's shriek. The true nightmare lives in the knowledge of how close the dark truly is. Every time he walks past a brick wall or a cracked pavement, his eyes involuntarily lock onto the gaps. He realizes that you can be completely safe walking through a modern city with absolute confidence, entirely unaware that just inside the solid structures of the world, something is sitting in the narrow spaces, chattering its teeth, and waiting for someone to find the crack in the stone. The draw of utilizing a massive metropolitan subway system is that it offers a perfectly predictable, synchronized way to navigate the chaotic underbelly of a major city. Every single day, millions of commuters step onto these subterranean platforms, swipe their transit cards, and board steel transit cars that hurtle through dark, brick-lined tunnels at 60 miles per hour. It is an environment defined by routine, public crowds, and a complete reliance on transit security. But for 36-year-old night shift transit security monitor Marcus Briggs, a late-night surveillance rotation at a major underground junction in Brooklyn, New York, in the spring of 2022 would turn into a horrifying demonstration of how fragile that security truly is. He would discover that a closed-circuit television monitor can capture an event that completely defies the laws of physical reality, and that some passengers who board the train at midnight have absolutely no intention of ever stepping off. The setting for the story is the Hoyt-Schermerhorn subway station, a deep, multi-level transit knot located beneath downtown Brooklyn. It was the 24th of April, 2022, a night where a bitter, unseasonable spring downpour had flooded the street gutters above, forcing a thick, heavy humidity down into the lower concrete platforms. The air inside the underground station was stagnant, chilly, and smelled intensely of hot steel brakes, damp concrete, and the faint, chemical scent of old garbage rot. Marcus was a highly disciplined, 9-year veteran of the Transit Authority's security division. He sat in a dimly lit, locked surveillance booth on the upper mezzanine level, surrounded by a massive wall of glowing monitors displaying live feeds from 40 different platforms and tunnel junctions. He was a practical, data-driven man who viewed the subway system as a giant, mechanical grid completely devoid of any belief in urban legends, ghost trains, or underground superstitions. Around 1:15 a.m., the heavy rush of late-night commuters had completely dwindled away, leaving the deep lower platforms in an eerie, absolute silence. Marcus leaned forward in his mesh chair, sipping a cup of black coffee, his eyes tracking the live feed of Platform 4, which serviced the late-night local trains heading toward the outer boroughs. At exactly 1:32 a.m., a vintage, faded silver transit car pulled into the empty station, its heavy brakes letting out a long metallic shriek that echoed through the tiled tunnels. The pneumatic doors slid open with a loud mechanical hiss, revealing a completely dark, unlit passenger compartment. Sitting perfectly still on the center orange bench of the dark car was a lone passenger. He looked like a 30-year-old man wearing a heavy, dark canvas jacket, his head bowed down toward his chest. Marcus tapped his keyboard, zooming the high-definition security camera closer to the train window to see if the passenger was experiencing a medical emergency. As the digital lens adjusted its focus, the smile completely vanished from Marcus's face. The image on his monitor was perfectly sharp, but the anatomy of the passenger was completely wrong. The man's canvas jacket was loose, but underneath the fabric, his torso was so incredibly emaciated that his ribs and an elongated, segmented spine pushed sharply against his clothing like jagged ridges. His skin, visible around his collar, was a dull, leathery, bruised gray color, completely hairless and glistened with a thick, clear fluid that looked like liquid mucus. His double-jointed arms were twice the length of a normal human's, his long, multi-jointed fingers ending in sharp black claws that were buried deep into the fiberglass structure of the bench. But it was the head that made the breath catch sharply in Marcus's throat. The passenger's neck was long, thin, and twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle, causing his hairless, pale skull to hang completely upside down between his shoulders. He had no visible nose or ears, but where the eyes should have been, the infrared sensor of the security camera caught the brilliant, blinding reflection of two massive, glassy black orbs. The entity was staring straight into the surveillance lens, its unhinged jaw wide open, revealing a series of jagged, calcified ridges running along its gums. Marcus sat perfectly paralyzed in the dark security booth, the pale blue glow of the monitor screens illuminating his face. His logical brain tried to reject it. He watched the digital timer on the screen tick forward. The train doors remained open for exactly 30 seconds, but nobody stepped off and nobody boarded. Then, from the desktop audio monitor on Marcus's console, which broadcast the live audio feed from the Platform 4 microphone, came a sound. It wasn't the low hum of the train's generator, and it wasn't the wind rushing through the shafts. It was a sharp, dry, rapid clicking noise, the rhythmic chattering of bone against bone at an impossible velocity. And as Marcus watched in absolute, unadulterated horror, the creature slowly shifted its weight off the orange bench. It dropped onto all fours, its long, double-jointed limbs moving with a fluid, spider-like velocity as it compressed its entire 7-foot frame flat against the floor of the train car, heading straight toward the open sliding doors. Marcus realized with an absolute terrifying certainty that if that door closed and the train moved into the dark transit tunnels, the entity would be loose within the core infrastructure of the city. He slammed his hand onto the emergency radio button, his voice cracking with pure survival adrenaline as he ordered the platform conductor to hold the train and seal the lower platform gates. The mechanical chattering from the intercom speaker accelerated, growing so loud that the audio amplifiers began to clip and hiss. The entity slid out of the dark car, its long limbs propelling its body across the wet concrete of Platform 4, moving directly toward the base of the security booth's stairwell. Marcus did not wait for the creature to reach the top of the stairs. He lunged across the control console, slamming the switch down. A series of thick, reinforced steel security grates dropped from the ceiling with a deafening crash, sealing the security booth behind a solid metal barrier just as a heavy impact rattled the outer walls. Through the glass viewing window, Marcus could see the steel grates vibrating under a succession of rapid, violent strikes. The entity was on the other side of the glass, compressed flat against the vertical concrete wall of the mezzanine corridor. It brought its hands up against the glass partition, its long, black, calcified claws scraping against the smooth surface with a slow, agonizing shriek. Screech. Then, the desktop audio monitor on his console erupted into a chaotic mess of sound. The creature opened its unhinged jaw wide, and a voice came out of the speaker. It was a perfectly flat, mechanical male tone, repeating Marcus's own security badge number and his full name over and over again in an identical dead loop. Officer Marcus Briggs. Officer Marcus Briggs. Monitor station closed. The sheer, psychological horror broke Marcus's mind. He backed away from the console, his knees giving out as he collapsed onto the concrete floor of the booth, covering his ears with both hands to block out the rhythmic chattering of bone against bone that followed. The New York City Transit Police and a heavily armed tactical response unit arrived at the Hoyt-Schermerhorn station at approximately 2:15 a.m., initiating a full lockdown of the entire transit line. When the tactical sweep team entered the upper mezzanine level with high-powered searchlights, the corridor was completely quiet. The humid air smelled intensely of copper, hot grease, and a thick, sulfur-like chemical rot. The passenger was completely gone. The reinforced steel security grates outside Marcus's booth were deeply dented, covered in thick, parallel gouge marks that had sliced straight through the metal coating. What the Transit Authority's internal engineering team discovered when they analyzed the structural telemetry of the station's lower tunnels is what caused the entire deep platform level to be permanently sealed from the public within 72 hours. The investigators found that the creature had ripped open a heavy iron ventilation grate located directly beneath the third rail on Platform 4, cutting straight into a massive, forgotten network of unmapped maintenance tunnels that ran parallel to the active subway lines for miles. The old brick walls of the forgotten grid were completely covered in thousands of long, five-fingered claw marks worn smooth by years of subterranean movement. The creature hadn't just boarded the train that night. It had been utilizing the forgotten, abandoned transit networks constructed during the early development of the city to navigate beneath the feet of millions of unsuspecting Brooklyn residents for decades, traveling from borough to borough completely undetected. Furthermore, when the digital analysts recovered the backup data from Marcus's terminal before the power failure, they realized the vintage silver transit car hadn't suffered an electrical glitch. The diagnostic log showed that the internal lights of the car had been drained by a massive localized electromagnetic draw, meaning the entity was naturally capable of manipulating electrical infrastructure simply by accelerating the rhythmic clicking of its own skeletal joints. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority permanently closed Platform 4 of the Hoyt-Schermerhorn station 3 weeks after the incident. A specialized construction crew used 500 tons of industrial concrete to wall off the lower tunnels completely, pouring liquid cement into the ventilation shafts and erasing the platform from all future transit maps and public directories. Marcus Briggs never monitored a security screen again, and he never rode a subway train again. He resigned from his position at the Transit Authority, packed his belongings into a U-Haul truck, and relocated to a small single-story home in the flat, sun-baked desert of western Texas, a region with no underground transit, no deep tunnels, and absolutely no subterranean infrastructure. He managed to build a quiet daytime routine as a rural delivery driver, but the psychological scars of that April night remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to enter any building with a basement, he cannot tolerate dark, enclosed rooms, and he leaves a high-powered tactical lantern burning on his nightstand 24 hours a day. Because according to Marcus, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's upside-down face. The true horror lives in the realization of what is riding right beneath us. Every time he hears a faint, muffled rumble from the ground or watches a shadow shift near a floor vent, his entire body goes completely cold. He realizes that humanity is just walking on a thin, fragile crust of concrete and asphalt, entirely unaware that deep within the ancient, forgotten foundations of the city, something impossible is breathing, chattering its teeth, and waiting for the next passenger to step off. The field of geology is usually a slow, methodical science. You spend your days looking at layers of rock, analyzing core samples, and measuring structural shifts that take millions of years to occur. It is a predictable discipline, rooted firmly in physical laws and historical proof. But for 41-year-old senior structural geologist Logan Vance, a core drilling project in the rugged wilderness of western Wyoming in the fall of 2018 would turn his understanding of the Earth completely upside down. He and his team would find out that when you drill deep into the untouched crust of the planet, you aren't just uncovering history. Sometimes you are opening a door. The setting for the story is the Wind River mountain range, an isolated, brutal expanse of granite peaks, deep glacial canyons, and dense pine forests. It was the 14th of September 2018, a day where a sudden alpine cold front had pushed down from the mountains, dropping the temperature below freezing and causing a thick, freezing mountain mist to settle over the drilling site. Logan was leading a 4-person research team under a federal grant to assess the structural integrity of a deep granite fault line. The team included a drilling technician named Chloe, an acoustic engineer named Marcus, and a graduate student. They were operating a massive automated diamond head core drill mounted to the back of a heavy utility truck positioned in a remote rock-strewn basin about 8 miles from the nearest dirt logging road. By 4:15 p.m., the drill had been running continuously for 6 hours, its heavy mechanical rumble echoing off the steep granite walls of the basin. The drill head had penetrated exactly 1,200 feet into the solid granite bedrock, pulling up cylindrical tubes of gray stone that Chloe carefully cataloged and stacked in wooden crates inside their main command tent. At exactly 4:32 p.m., the drill's automated safety system suddenly triggered, causing the entire utility truck to shake violently before the mechanical hum died out completely, leaving the basin in a sudden, deafening silence. Logan stepped out of the command tent, his boots crunching against the frozen gravel, and approached the rig. Chloe was already looking at the digital control panel, her face pale in the pale light of the display screen. She told Logan that the drill head hadn't jammed against hard quartz, it had dropped. The sensor reading showed that at precisely 1,204 feet, the diamond bit had punched through the solid bedrock into a massive, completely unmapped subterranean void. A void at that depth in solid granite was geologically impossible. Intrigued, Logan instructed Marcus to lower a specialized high-definition borehole camera down the shaft. The camera was attached to a heavy spool of fiber optic cable, equipped with an array of ultra-bright LED lights and a highly sensitive directional microphone meant to pick up seismic vibrations. For 10 minutes, the team stood inside the dark command tent, watching the video monitor as the camera descended down the narrow 4-inch-wide borehole. The screen showed nothing but the smooth, gray, vertical walls of drilled granite passing by at a steady pace. 1,200 feet, 1,201, 1,203. Then, the gray stone walls vanished. The camera broke through the ceiling of the void, entering a vast, pitch-black space. The ultra-bright LED lights cut through the darkness, but they couldn't find the floor or the walls of the chamber. The void was immense, an underground abyss that defied any geological explanation. Marcus adjusted the acoustic audio feed, turning the volume up on the tent's monitor speakers. At first, there was only the faint, high-pitched hiss of static. But as Logan stepped closer to the screen, the static was replaced by a sound that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It was a low, rhythmic vibration. It sounded exactly like the wet, slow, heavy breathing of an incredibly large pair of lungs. Logan frowned, telling Marcus to check for a technical malfunction or a wind tunnel effect from the surface. But before Marcus could touch the audio dial, the camera's video feed flickered violently. The camera had descended 20 feet into the void when the directional microphone picked up a new sound. It was a sharp, dry, rapid clicking noise. It sounded like bone chattering against bone at an impossible speed. Then, the camera's automated motion tracker triggered. The digital green box on the monitor screen snapped toward the very edge of the light beam, focusing on something that was rising up from the darkness below the lens. Logan leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the metal table. Emerging into the blue-white glare of the borehole lights was a face. It was immeasurably long and emaciated, its gray, leathery skin stretched so tight over the skull that the white bone structure underneath was visible through the flesh. It had no nose, no ears, and its unhinged jaw was wide open, sliding rhythmically from side to side to create that horrific clicking sound. But what made Logan's blood turn to ice were the eyes. They were two massive, glassy black orbs that completely reflected the LED lights, staring straight up the narrow 4-inch shaft directly into the camera lens. The creature didn't just look at the device. With a fluid, terrifying velocity, it raised a long skeletal arm, its multi-jointed fingers ending in sharp black claws, and gripped the camera housing. The monitor screen exploded into green static, and the fiber optic cable on the heavy spool outside began to spin backward with a violent, snapping force as if something in the deep dark was pulling the line down. Marcus screamed, reaching out to hit the manual emergency cutoff switch. The cable snapped with a loud report, the loose end whipping through the air and tearing a gash into the fabric wall of the tent. Logan stood paralyzed, the sound of the creature's wet, chattering, still echoing faintly through the dead speakers. He looked at Chloe, whose eyes were wide with pure survival terror. He told the team to abandon the equipment, get into their secondary transport SUV, and drive back to the ranger station immediately. They scrambled out of the tent into the freezing mountain mist. The darkness had fully settled over the Wind River Basin, the towering granite peaks silhouetted against a starless sky. As Logan reached the driver's side door of the SUV, he stopped. The heavy core drill rig, mounted to the utility truck 50 feet away, was shaking. The thick steel stabilizers dug into the frozen ground were groaning under an immense upward pressure. From inside the narrow 4-inch borehole on the ground, a low, wet, rhythmic chattering sound began to rise, vibrating through the solid stone of the basin. The entity wasn't staying down in the void, it was climbing the shaft. The steel stabilizers of the drilling truck gave out with a deafening metallic snap, the heavy frame of the vehicle listing violently to the right as the ground beneath it began to buckle. Logan did not hesitate. He threw open the SUV door, screaming at Chloe and Marcus to get in. They dove into the back seat just as a thick, viscous cloud of gray dust and putrid air erupted from the open 4-inch borehole, smelling sharply of sulfur, copper, and ancient rot. Logan slammed his foot onto the accelerator, the tires screaming against the frozen gravel as the SUV lunged away from the drilling site. Through the rearview mirror, under the pale glow of the vehicle's reverse lights, Logan watched the drilling rig. The heavy steel drill pipe, which extended 1,200 feet into the earth, was being pushed straight out of the ground. It rose like a massive skeletal finger, bending and snapping under an impossible upward force from below. And then the truck itself was flipped completely onto its side as the earth around the borehole fractured open. Logan accelerated down the narrow, unpaved logging road, the headlights cutting through the thick mountain mist. The road was a treacherous labyrinth of sharp switchbacks and steep drops, but he drove with a frantic, reckless speed, completely consumed by the need to put distance between his team and that basin. In the back seat, Marcus was hyperventilating, his hands clamped tightly over his ears as if he could still hear that wet, rhythmic clicking echoing through the air. Chloe was staring out the back window, her body shaking violently in the chill of the cabin. They drove for 45 minutes in absolute silence, the SUV bouncing brutally over the ruts in the dirt road before finally hitting the paved surface of Highway 191. Logan didn't stop at the local ranger station. He drove straight to the Sublette County Sheriff's Department in Pinedale, Wyoming. The responding deputies took their statements in separate interrogation rooms. The story sounded completely insane, a 7-foot, emaciated creature climbing out of a 1,200-foot deep borehole in solid granite. But Logan's status as a senior geologist and the sheer physical trauma visible on the faces of his team forced the sheriff to take the report seriously. At dawn, a tactical sweep team consisting of 6 armed deputies and 2 federal land rangers escorted Logan back to the remote basin to secure the government property and assess the site. When the caravan of vehicles rounded the final ridge and entered the rock-strewn basin, the scene was completely dead. The mountain mist had cleared under the morning sun, revealing the true extent of the destruction. The heavy utility truck was resting on its side, its chassis twisted and broken. The automated core drill was completely destroyed, the diamond head bit shattered into hundreds of pieces across the gravel. But what the federal investigators discovered when they approached the actual borehole is what caused the entire project to be classified under an immediate national security protocol. The 4-inch hole in the granite bedrock was no longer 4 inches wide. The solid, ancient stone had been violently widened from the inside out, fractured into a jagged 3-foot-wide chasm. The interior walls of the upper shaft were covered in deep, parallel gouge marks that had cut straight through the solid rock, as if something with diamond-hard claws had dug its way up the 1,200 feet of vertical granite. Furthermore, when the forensics team analyzed the command tent, they found Marcus's digital monitor screen resting on the metal table. The glass wasn't just cracked, the surface had been deeply etched from the outside with a single repetitive pattern. When the technicians ran a light scanner over the etched glass, they realized it formed a crude, terrifyingly precise anatomical drawing of a human heart, with a small X marked right in the center of the left ventricle. The entity that climbed out of the Wind River void has never been captured or sighted since that morning. Within 48 hours of the incident, a convoy of unmarked federal vehicles arrived at the basin. A specialized engineering crew poured 40 tons of industrial-grade liquid concrete directly into the fractured chasm, sealing the entrance to the void under a massive, reinforced block that was subsequently buried under hundreds of tons of loose granite boulders. The federal grant was canceled, the geological data was seized, and Logan and his team were forced to sign strict, lifetime non-disclosure agreements. Logan Vance never looked at a core sample again. He resigned from his university tenure, sold his home in Wyoming, and moved to a small coastal town in southern Florida, where the geology consists entirely of shallow sand, coral reefs, and water, a place where the deep, dark interior of the earth cannot be reached by a drill. He managed to build a quiet, isolated routine, but the psychological weight of that autumn afternoon remains completely unhealed. He refuses to enter basements, he cannot tolerate the sound of mechanical drilling of any kind, and he uses an electronic noise-canceling system in his bedroom just to sleep. Because according to Logan, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the creature's face or the static on the screen. The true horror lives in the realization of what is happening beneath our feet. Every time he feels a slight tremor from a passing truck or hears the low hum of distant machinery, his body freezes. He realizes that humanity is just living on a thin, fragile crust of reality, completely unaware that deep within the ancient, untouched foundations of the world, something else is breathing, chattering its teeth, and waiting for us to drill the next hole. The appeal of extreme solo night hiking is that it forces you to rely entirely on your own senses. When you are miles away from the nearest paved road, in the dead of night, the world shrinks down to the exact width of your flashlight beam. Everything outside that circle of white light does not exist. It is a liberating, intense feeling, but it also carries a terrifying reality. If you are entirely dependent on that single beam of light to see the world, you are also completely vulnerable to whatever is standing just outside the edge of the glow. For 32-year-old high school track coach Derek Vance, a late-night hike through the rugged wilderness of Western Oregon in the summer of 2021 would turn into a masterclass in psychological survival. He would find out that sometimes your light doesn't protect you from the dark, it just shows you what is waiting for you inside it. The setting for this story is the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest, a massive, ancient wilderness characterized by steep, timber-covered ridges, deep granite canyons, and miles of dense, overgrown trails. It was the 14th of August, 2021, a night where the Pacific Northwest air was heavily thick, smelling of damp cedar needles, wild ferns, and the faint, sweet scent of oncoming summer rain. Derek was an elite athlete and an experienced outdoorsman. He routinely went on night runs and hikes to clear his head, carrying a lightweight tactical backpack, a heavy-duty military-grade flashlight, and a handheld GPS unit. He was a practical, logic-driven guy who didn't believe in superstitions, ghosts, or urban legends. He viewed the forest as a gym, nothing more. Around 11:45 p.m., Derek was about 6 miles deep into an isolated loop trail called the Panther Ridge Track. The silence of the forest at this hour was total, dead, and absolute. The heavy canopy of old-growth Douglas firs blocked out the light from the stars, leaving the trail in a state of pitch-black darkness that felt almost physical. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic crunch of his own trail shoes pressing into the dry pine needles and the heavy, controlled sound of his breathing. As he reached a narrow switchback that overlooked a steep, dark ravine, Derek felt a sudden, inexplicable drop in the temperature. The warm summer air vanished, replaced by a freezing, icy draft that made his breath instantly form thick white plumes of vapor in the air. He stopped walking. He held his breath, standing perfectly still on the dirt path, listening intently. At first, there was nothing. But then, from about 40 feet down, the steep, brush-covered slope to his right, came a very distinct sound. It was a slow, heavy snap of a thick pine branch. Crack. Derek didn't panic. In Oregon, black bears and black-tailed deer are incredibly common, and they frequently forage for berries near the trails at night. He figured he had simply startled a large animal that was bedding down for the evening. He raised his heavy flashlight, aiming the 500-lumen beam down into the dark brush, expecting to see the brown fur of a deer or the white tail of an elk. He clicked the button. The brilliant white light sliced through the darkness, illuminating the jagged green ferns, the rough bark of the cedar trees, and the gray granite boulders scattered along the slope. The brush was completely empty. There was no bear, no deer, and no animal of any kind. Derek frowned, keeping the light focused on the area. He let out a short, tense whistle, trying to scare off whatever was hiding in the shadows. But the forest did not respond. The silence returned, but it felt different now. It felt heavy, deliberate, as if the darkness itself was pressing against the edges of his light beam. Derek clicked the flashlight off, returning the world to absolute blackness, and took 2 steps forward to resume his hike. The moment his shoes touched the dirt, he heard the sound again. But it wasn't down in the ravine anymore. It was directly ahead of him on the main trail, about 20 feet away, hidden just past the sharp curve of the switchback. It was a wet, heavy, sliding sound, like someone dragging a sack of wet leather across the rocks. Slide, pause, slide, pause. Derek's heart gave a sudden, violent thud against his ribs. That wasn't the sound of an animal. An animal moves with a specific 4-legged rhythm, or it crashes through the brush to get away from a human. This movement was slow, calculating, and completely unbothered by his presence. Derek raised the flashlight again, his fingers tightening around the cold aluminum casing. He snapped the beam on, directing the light straight down the center of the narrow dirt path. The white light cut through the mist, and Derek's entire body went completely rigid. Standing right in the center of the trail, fully illuminated by the high-powered beam, was an entity. It was impossibly tall, standing well over 7 feet, but its body was so emaciated that its ribs and hip bones were pushing sharply against its skin like skeletal ridges. The flesh was a dull, waxy, bruised gray color, completely hairless and glistened with a thick, clear fluid that looked like liquid mucus. The limbs were twice the length of a normal man's, its long arms dangling so low that its multi-jointed fingers, ending in sharp black claws, were scraping gently against the dirt of the path. But it was the head that made Derek's blood run completely ice cold. The creature's neck was long, thin, and twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle, causing its hairless head to hang upside down from its shoulders. It had no nose or ears, just a smooth, pale skull, but where the eyes should have been, the flashlight beam caught the brilliant, blinding reflection of 2 massive, glassy black orbs. The creature was staring directly into the light lens, its unhinged jaw wide open, revealing a series of jagged, calcified ridges running along its gums. From deep within its throat came a low, rapid, dry clicking sound, the rhythmic chattering of bone against bone. Derek stood perfectly paralyzed, the heavy flashlight shaking so violently in his hand that the circle of white light was dancing erratically across the creature's leathery chest. His logical brain completely fractured. He wanted to run, he wanted to scream, but his muscles refused to obey his commands. The creature didn't sprint toward him, it slowly shifted its weight, dragging its left leg forward with a heavy metallic scrape against the granite rocks. Scrape, step, scrape, step. It was walking directly into the center of the flashlight beam, completely unfazed by the light, its upside-down head twitching rhythmically from side to side as the clicking sound from its throat grew louder and louder, filling the entire silent canyon. Derek realized with absolute certainty that if he stayed on that path for another 5 seconds, he would never leave the forest. With a desperate, breathless scream, he broke through his paralysis. He didn't turn around to run back up the mountain trail. The creature was too close, and the switchbacks were too narrow. Instead, Derek threw his body sideways, leaping straight off the edge of the trail into the pitch-black, brush-covered ravine to his left. He tumbled down the steep slope, his body slamming against sharp rocks, tearing through thick blackberry briars, and losing his grip on his heavy flashlight as he fell. The device hit a boulder, bouncing away into the darkness, its white beam pointing uselessly up toward the sky. Derek landed hard at the bottom of the ravine, the wind knocked completely out of his lungs. He lay in the cold mud, gasping for air, his clothes torn and his arms covered in deep, bleeding lacerations. Above him, from the dark trail he had just leaped from, the rapid, four-legged scrambling started. Thump, 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 thump. The entity was descending the slope, its long limbs propelling its emaciated body through the thick brush with an insect-like speed, tracking the sound of his fall. The rapid, insect-like scrambling came crashing down the slope of the ravine, snapping thick branches and tearing through the dense ferns with terrifying ease. Thump, 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 thump. The entity was moving entirely on all fours now, its long, emaciated limbs propelling its weight through the pitch blackness with a fluid, unnatural agility. Derek lay gasping in the mud, his ribs aching from the fall. The tactical flashlight he had dropped was sitting about 15 feet away, wedged against a rotten cedar stump, its brilliant white beam pointing straight up into the dense canopy of the Douglas firs. The light created a narrow, vertical pillar of white illumination in the middle of the dark ravine. Derek knew he couldn't stand up and run. His left ankle was severely sprained from the tumble, throbbing with a sharp, white-hot pain. He could hear the creature closing the distance, the heavy, wet sliding of its leathery flesh against the wet moss, and that dry, rhythmic chattering of bone against bone echoing through the trees. Click, 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 click. With no other choice, Derek dragged his body backward into the hollow, decayed underside of a massive, fallen redwood trunk just behind him. He pulled his knees tight to his chest, pressing his back against the damp, crumbling wood, and covered his mouth with both hands to muffle the sound of his frantic, ragged breathing. A second later, the creature entered the narrow pillar of light cast by the dropped flashlight. From his hiding spot in the hollow log, Derek had a clear, unhindered view. The entity walked directly into the beam, its 7-foot frame cutting through the white light. It stopped right next to the rotten cedar stump. It didn't search the ground with hands. Instead, its long, thin neck elongated even further, lowering its upside-down head until its face was just inches away from the burning LED lens of the flashlight. The two massive, glassy black orbs dilated, absorbing the intense light without a single blink. It tilted its head at that horrific 90-degree angle, sniffing the cold air, its unhinged jaw twitching as a thick, clear string of fluid dripped from its calcified ridges onto the aluminum casing of the light. Then the creature raised one of its long, double-jointed arms and slowly brought its black claw down onto the lens. Crush! The flashlight shattered, instantly plunging the entire ravine into absolute pitch-black darkness. The silence that followed was total and suffocating. Derek held his breath, his heart hammering so violently against his ribs he was certain the creature could hear it. He could smell it now, a sharp, copper-like stench mixed with stagnant river water and old rot, filling the interior of the hollow log. For 3 agonizing minutes, nothing happened. There was no movement, no sound, no wind. Then, right outside the opening of his log, Derek heard the soft, wet sliding of flesh against the mud. The creature was crawling on its stomach, circling the perimeter of the fallen redwood. It was inches away. Derek could hear the dry scraping of its black claws against the exterior bark of the very log he was hiding inside. Scrape, slide, scrape. Just as the copper smell became unbearable and a low, wet hiss vibrated through the wood right above Derek's head, a sudden, blinding flash of light cut through the trees from the ridge above. It was followed by the loud, echoing blast of a horn and a booming human voice shouting through a megaphone. A search team from the Douglas County Sheriff's Department, accompanied by volunteers from a local mountain rescue group, had just reached the switchback. Derek's wife had called the authorities when he failed to check in by midnight, and because he had an active GPS tracker on his backpack, the team had been able to pinpoint his exact coordinates. The moment the bright floodlights from the ridge cut through the canopy, the entity let out a high-pitched, metallic shriek, a sound like iron tearing apart and bolted. It didn't climb back up to the trail, it scrambled down the remaining length of the ravine, its four limbs moving with an impossible frantic speed until the sound of its clicking faded into the deep, unmapped canyons of the forest. The rescue team descended the slope with ropes and stretchers, finding Derek inside the hollow log 20 minutes later. He was hyperventilating, his hands still locked over his mouth, his eyes wide and completely unfocused, refusing to let go of a heavy, jagged rock he had grabbed to defend himself. The Oregon State Police conducted a full investigation of the Panther Ridge track over the following weekend. When a team of forensic deputies reached the bottom of the ravine to retrieve Derek's backpack and his shattered flashlight, they discovered a series of disturbing physical anomalies. The aluminum casing of the tactical flashlight hadn't just been stepped on, the heavy metal had been twisted and melted, covered in a highly acidic, clear secretion that had literally eaten through the tempered glass lens and the electronic circuitry inside. Furthermore, when trackers attempted to follow the line of the creature's escape down the canyon, they found that the wet, five-fingered claw prints didn't stop at the riverbed. The team discovered a network of deep, horizontal burrows dug directly into the vertical clay banks of the Rogue River. These tunnels were completely hidden beneath the water level, measuring barely 2 feet in diameter, wide enough only for an emaciated, boneless frame to slide through, meaning the entity had been navigating the entire park system unseen using the subterranean waterways. The Douglas County authorities permanently closed the Panther Ridge Loop Trail 3 weeks later, citing hazardous terrain conditions and a sudden spike in local wildlife aggression. The trail was removed from all official forestry maps, and the entrance was blocked by heavy timber barricades. Derek Vance never went night hiking again. He resigned from his position as a track coach, sold his home in Western Oregon, and moved his family to a modern high-rise concrete apartment complex in downtown Las Vegas, Nevada, a place where the terrain is completely flat, the desert sun bakes the earth dry, and the artificial lights never turn off. He managed to recover his physical routine, but the psychological scars of that August night remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to enter any dark spaces, he will not go near bodies of water, and he keeps every light in his home turned on 24 hours a day. Because according to Derek, the true terror of the experience isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's upside-down face. The true terror lives in the realization of how deceptive the world truly is. Every time he looks out a window at night or watches a shadow shift in a corner, his body goes cold. He realizes that you can be completely in control of your life, moving forward with absolute confidence, entirely unaware that just outside the tiny circle of your safety, something impossible is standing in the dark, watching you and waiting for your light to go out. The appeal of exploring old, abandoned civil defense systems is that they offer a tangible glimpse into a time when the entire nation was gripped by a deep collective paranoia. During the height of the Cold War, the government constructed thousands of massive, reinforced underground bunkers and drainage networks beneath major American cities, meant to keep humanity safe from an absolute catastrophe. Decades later, these spaces sit completely forgotten, hidden just beneath the pavement of our modern streets. But for 27-year-old urban explorer and civil engineer Julian Vance, a late-night descent into a historic storm vault beneath downtown Cincinnati, Ohio, in the spring of 2017 would turn into a masterclass in psychological survival. He would discover that the most terrifying part of entering a subterranean labyrinth isn't losing your way in the dark, it is realizing that you should never look up at the ceiling. The setting for this story is the underground drainage network beneath the Over-the-Rhine district in Cincinnati. It was the 14th of April 2017, a night where a heavy Midwestern thunderstorm had just passed, leaving the city air thick, humid, and smelling of wet asphalt. Down inside the concrete vaults, however, The atmosphere was completely stagnant, freezing, and smelled heavily of damp clay, old iron rust, and ancient stone rot. Julian was a highly disciplined explorer. He didn't take reckless risks. He always carried a dual-battery tactical headlamp, a backup high-powered flashlight, and he left his exact entry coordinates with a close friend on the surface. He viewed these forgotten structures through a lens of architecture and history, completely empty of any superstitions or ghost stories. Around 11:15 p.m., Julian navigated his way through a massive rusted steel overflow valve located near an abandoned rail yard, stepping off his portable ladder onto the brick floor of a primary interceptor tunnel exactly 40 feet beneath the city streets. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic rushing of overflow water echoing from distant pipes and the slow, heavy drip of condensation striking the floor. Drip, pause, drip. For over 2 hours, Julian walked through these spectacular arched brick tunnels, taking structural measurements and documenting the unique 1950s masonry. The blue-white beam of his headlamp cut through the heavy mist, illuminating the smooth, wet walls and the old rusted safety ladders that led up to sealed manhole covers. At exactly 1:32 a.m., Julian entered a massive circular junction vault where 4 separate tunnels converged. The ceiling of this room vaulted upward into a magnificent 40-foot dome made of solid, reinforced concrete blocks. The floor was covered in a shallow layer of cold, slow-moving water that reached just above his ankles. Julian set his waterproof gear bag down on a raised concrete ledge, pulled out a digital thermal thermometer to log the ambient conditions, and decided to take a short rest before starting the long climb back to the surface. The silence in the massive dome was total, absolute, and suffocating. Then, from the darkness directly above his head, near the absolute center of the vaulted ceiling, came a sound. It wasn't the metallic ping of a water droplet, and it wasn't the groan of settling concrete. It was a sharp, dry, rapid clicking noise. It sounded exactly like bone chattering against bone at an impossible speed, vibrating through the empty dome with an immense rhythmic clarity. Click, 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 click. Julian froze, his muscles locking up instantly as his adrenaline spiked. His logical mind told him it was a swarm of bats, or perhaps a nesting raccoon that had found its way into the upper air vents. He slowly reached down to his belt, his hand shaking slightly as he gripped his secondary 500-lumen flashlight and snapped the bright white beam straight up into the center of the concrete dome. The brilliant light sliced through the darkness, and Julian's entire body went completely rigid. Crouching flat against the vertical concrete blocks, hanging completely upside down like a massive predatory insect, was an entity. It was impossibly tall, its emaciated torso compressed tight against the ceiling, its ribs and long, segmented spine pushing sharply against its skin like jagged ridges. Its flesh was a dull, leathery, bruised gray color, completely hairless and glistened with a thick, clear fluid that looked like liquid mucus. Its double-jointed limbs were twice the length of a normal man's, its long arms ending in multi-jointed fingers with sharp black claws that were dug deep into the narrow mortar seams of the concrete blocks. But it was the face that made the breath catch sharply in Julian's throat. The creature's neck was long, thin, and twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle, causing its hairless skull to hang completely backward from its shoulders, staring straight down the vertical light beam directly into Julian's eyes. It had no visible nose or ears, just a smooth, pale skull, but its face was dominated by 2 massive, glassy black orbs that completely reflected the glare of the flashlight. Its unhinged jaw was wide open, revealing a series of jagged, calcified ridges running along its gums as it chattered its teeth to create that deafening clicking sound. Julian stood perfectly paralyzed in the shallow water, the heavy aluminum flashlight trembling so violently in his grip that the circle of white light was dancing erratically across the creature's leathery chest. The creature didn't retreat from the light, and it didn't drop to the floor. It slowly shifted its weight, its black claws scraping against the concrete with a sharp, shattering sound as it began to crawl horizontally across the ceiling, moving with a fluid, terrifying velocity directly toward the space right above Julian's head. Julian broke through his paralysis with a breathless, panicked cry. He didn't try to retrieve his waterproof gear bag from the concrete ledge. He turned on his heel and bolted into the narrow, arched brick interceptor tunnel he had used to enter the junction, his heavy boots splashing violently through the ankle-deep water. The blue-white beam of his headlamp bounced frantically up and down, illuminating the sweating brickwork and the low-hanging lime deposits. The air in the tunnel felt instantly hot and suffocating, turning thick with that sharp, copper-like stench of old rot and stagnant sewer mud that coated his throat with every frantic gasp. Behind him, from the circular dome, came a sound that made his stomach drop. It wasn't the sound of something landing in the water. The entity was still on the ceiling. It was a rapid, four-legged scrambling, a succession of solid, wet impacts against the brick archway directly above him. Thump, 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 thump. The creature was moving upside down, its long, double-jointed limbs propelling its emaciated body across the ceiling mortar with an absolute insect-like velocity, tracking the vibration of Julian's panicked run. A thick drop of the creature's clear fluid fell from the brick ceiling, striking Julian right on his shoulder. It burned slightly through his cotton shirt, smelling intensely of sulfur and old river clay. Julian pushed his legs to their absolute limit, his lungs screaming for oxygen. He reached the straight stretch of the interceptor line where the old rusted safety ladder led up to the overflow valve and his portable ladder. He grabbed the iron rungs, hauling his upper body out of the water, and began to climb with a frantic, adrenaline-fueled strength. He was 10 feet up, 15 feet up, his hands slipping against the wet rust of the bars. Suddenly, the rapid clicking sound from behind him stopped. Julian paused for a fraction of a second, his heart hammering so violently against his ribs he could hear it over the rushing water. He turned his head downward, directing the beam of his headlamp down into the dark vertical shaft. The entity had reached the base of the ladder. It didn't try to climb the rungs. It slowly tilted its hairless skull back, its two massive, glassy black orbs dilating as they absorbed the intense white light without a single blink. Then, with a sudden, fluid motion, it leaped straight onto the vertical brick wall of the shaft, its black claws digging deep into the ancient mortar as it began to scamper upward like a massive gecko, heading straight for his heels. Julian screamed, a raw sound of pure survival terror, and scrambled up the remaining rungs. He reached the narrow horizontal overflow valve, threw his torso through the opening, and tumbled onto the muddy gravel of the abandoned rail yard outside. The cool night air hit his face, and the distant rumble of the city streets felt like a lifeline. He didn't pull his portable ladder up. He scrambled to his feet, running blindly through the dark rail yard toward his utility truck parked under a street lamp a quarter-mile away. He dove into the front seat, locked the doors, and slammed his foot onto the accelerator, his body shaking so violently he could barely keep the vehicle in the center of the lane as he tore away from the over-the-Rhine district. The Cincinnati Police Department received Julian's panicked report at approximately 2:15 a.m. He was hyperventilating, his clothes torn, and his fingers were bleeding from the rusted iron rungs of the safety ladder. The responding officers, seeing the sheer state of shock on the young civil engineer's face, organized a tactical search team consisting of 4 armed officers and a city utility supervisor to secure the overflow valve at dawn. When the team arrived at the abandoned rail yard the following morning under a gray, overcast sky, the site was completely quiet. The storm had left the gravel tracks heavy with mist. 2 officers, armed with tactical shotguns and high-powered searchlights, lowered themselves into the overflow valve to inspect the interceptor tunnel and retrieve Julian's gear bag. When they reached the circular junction vault, they found Julian's waterproof bag sitting on the concrete ledge. The heavy nylon straps had been cleanly sliced through, and his digital thermal thermometer had been completely crushed into the brick floor, its internal circuitry pulverized into fine dust. But what the city engineering inspectors discovered when they used a high-powered structural camera to analyze the concrete dome of the vault is what caused the entire drainage section to be permanently sealed under an emergency public safety order. The 40-foot ceiling wasn't just old concrete. The structural camera revealed that the mortar seams between the concrete blocks had been systematically hollowed out from the inside. Something had spent years using its claws to carve a massive horizontal network of narrow crawlways inside the secondary ceiling insulation channels that were just wide enough for an emaciated, leathery body to slide through, completely hidden from the view of anyone standing on the floor below. The entity hadn't just chanced upon Julian that evening. It had been living inside the ceiling network of the city drainage system for decades, moving silently beneath the feet of thousands of downtown pedestrians, listening to the vibrations of the traffic, and waiting for someone to enter the junction alone in the dark. The city of Cincinnati permanently closed the over-the-Rhine overflow network 3 weeks later. A specialized construction crew used 10 tons of industrial concrete to seal the overflow valve completely, welding heavy steel plates over the entry points and erasing the vault from all active city engineering blueprints. Julian Vance never went urban exploring again. He resigned from his civil engineering firm, sold his property in Ohio, and moved to a small, single-story home in the flat, sun-baked plains of eastern New Mexico, a place where the terrain is completely level, the houses are built on solid concrete slabs with no basements, and the sky is a massive, unbroken expanse. He managed to build a quiet, routine life as a land surveyor, but the psychological scars of that April night remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to enter any building with high, vaulted ceilings, he cannot tolerate dark rooms, and he keeps a high-powered lantern burning in his hallway every single night. Because, according to Julian, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's upside-down face. The true horror lives in the knowledge of what is hovering right above us. Every time he walks through a modern hallway or feels a cold draft drop down from a ceiling vent, his entire body goes completely rigid. He realizes that humanity is just walking through life with absolute confidence, entirely unaware that just a few feet above their heads, inside the hidden structures of the world, something impossible is sitting in the dark, chattering its teeth, and waiting for you to look up. The field of deep-sea marine biology is one of the most frustrating sciences on the planet. We have better maps of the surface of Mars than we do of our own ocean floor. When you are operating a research vessel miles away from the coast, lowering millions of dollars of delicate equipment into a black abyss that is miles deep, you are completely at the mercy of the elements. It is an environment of absolute pressure, freezing temperatures, and total darkness. But for 38-year-old oceanographer Raymond Vance, a deep-sea mapping expedition off the coast of Northern California in the spring of 2019 would throw his entire team into a state of pure psychological terror. They would find out that when you drop a camera into a trench where the sun has never shone, you might pull up a secret that science is too terrified to share with the world. The setting for this story is the Mendocino Fracture Zone, a massive, jagged, underwater canyon system that plunges over 10,000 feet into the Pacific Ocean bedrock. It was the 14th of May, 2019, a night where a massive Pacific storm had rolled over the research vessel, forcing the crew to secure the upper decks as 12-foot swells slammed against the hull. Inside the main laboratory cabin, the atmosphere was incredibly tense, smelling of stale coffee, ozone from the electronic racks, and the heavy dampness of the sea. Raymond was a highly respected researcher who had spent 15 years tracking deep-sea tectonic activity for a federal marine institute. He was a logical, data-driven man who viewed the ocean as a machine to be studied, completely devoid of mythical sea monsters or old sailor superstitions. Along with him in the dark cabin were two colleagues, an acoustics technician named Ethan and a remote vehicle operator. Around 10:15 p.m., the team was utilizing a heavy, armored deep-sea submersible camera platform called the Abyssus 4. The platform was suspended by a heavy, steel-reinforced fiber optic cable dangling exactly 9,500 feet below the surface, right along the vertical rock face of the underwater canyon. At exactly 10:32 p.m., The submersible's high-definition video feed, which was being projected onto a large monitor screen in the center of the cabin, began to suffer from severe electromagnetic interference. Horizontal lines of green static rippled across the display, obscuring the image of the jagged basalt rock walls. Raymond leaned forward, tapping the edge of the metal console, telling Ethan to check the cable tension. Ethan checked the digital gauges and shook his head, his face turning pale under the fluorescent cabin lights. The tension was perfectly normal, but the acoustic hydrophone, the ultra-sensitive underwater microphone mounted to the camera frame, was picking up a massive spike in low-frequency audio. Ethan turned up the volume on the laboratory's main monitor speakers. At first, there was only the deep, rhythmic, rushing sound of the ocean current. But as Raymond stepped closer to the speakers, the rushing sound was replaced by a sound that made his stomach drop. It was a sharp, dry, rapid clicking noise. It sounded exactly like bone chattering against bone at an impossible speed, vibrating through the deep water with an immense rhythmic clarity. Click, 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 click. Raymond frowned, stating that a sound like that, at nearly 10,000 feet, was a biological impossibility. Marine mammals couldn't survive the pressure at this depth, and deep-sea fish didn't possess the skeletal structures required to create a dry bone click. Before he could finish his thought, the remote operator let out a short gasp, pointing a shaking finger at the video monitor. The armored camera platform had drifted into a massive horizontal cavern opening in the canyon wall. The ultra-bright, high-intensity LED floodlights mounted to the frame cut through the black ocean water, illuminating the entrance of the cave. And standing right inside the mouth of the cavern, perfectly centered in the blue-white glare of the lights, was a shape. The creature was towering, its height estimated at well over 7 feet, but its torso was so emaciated that its rib cage and long segmented spine pushed sharply against its skin like jagged ridges. Its flesh was a dull, leathery, bruised gray color, completely hairless and glistened with a clear, thick fluid. Its double-jointed limbs were twice the length of a normal human's, its long arms ending in multi-jointed fingers with sharp black claws that were gripping the edge of the basalt rock face. But it was the head that made Raymond's heart give a violent, uncomfortable thud against his ribs. The creature's neck was long, thin, and twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle, causing its hairless head to hang completely upside down between its broad shoulders. It had no visible nose or ears, just a smooth, pale skull, but where the eyes should have been, the high-intensity floodlights caught the brilliant, blinding reflection of two massive, glassy black orbs. The entity was staring straight through the camera lens, its unhinged jaw wide open, revealing a series of jagged, calcified ridges running along its gums as it chattered its teeth to create that deafening clicking sound. Raymond stood perfectly paralyzed in the dark cabin, the green static of the monitor illuminating his face, his mind completely fractured. The creature was living at a depth where the pressure would instantly crush a human being into a pulp, yet its body was completely intact, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace. The creature didn't retreat into the cave. It slowly shifted its weight, launching its 7-foot frame off the rock face, its long limbs propelling its body through the freezing water with an insect-like velocity, heading straight toward the suspended camera platform. Raymond screamed at the remote operator to winch the camera up, his voice cracking with pure survival panic. The operator slammed his hand onto the emergency hoist control, and the heavy electric motor on the upper deck roared to life, the steel-reinforced fiber optic cable groaning under the sudden, immense strain as it began to pull the platform back up toward the surface. Through the video monitor, despite the heavy horizontal bands of green static, Raymond watched the entity close the distance. It swam with an impossible erratic motion, its long, double-jointed limbs cutting through the black ocean water like the legs of a giant aquatic spider. Before the camera platform could rise 10 feet, the screen tilted violently. The creature had reached the frame. A long, gray, emaciated arm shot into the clear view of the lens, its black claws clamping around the heavy titanium housing of the upper floodlight. The metal groaned, a sound picked up by the hydrophone and broadcast into the quiet laboratory cabin as a deep, metallic screech. The creature pulled its face right up to the lens, its massive glassy black orbs filling the entire screen, its unhinged jaw twitching rapidly as it blasted that dry, rhythmic bone clicking straight into the microphone. The sound was so incredibly loud, it blew out the audio amplifiers in the laboratory console, filling the room with a sharp, burning smell of electrical fire. Then, the entity brought its other hand down onto the fiber optic cable connection. The monitor screen went completely black. The digital telemetry data vanished, replaced by an error message that read, "Signal lost, physical disconnect." Outside the cabin, on the storm-tossed upper deck, the heavy winch let out a horrific, high-pitched scream as the steel-reinforced cable snapped with a sound like a cannon shot. The loose end of the cable whipped through the air, smashing a heavy glass searchlight on the superstructure before spinning uselessly out into the ocean. Raymond stood perfectly still in the middle of the dark laboratory, his hands gripping the edge of the console, his chest heaving as the 12-foot swells continued to slam against the ship's hull. He looked at Ethan, whose face was completely devoid of color, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his clipboard. The research vessel returned to the port of Eureka, California, 24 hours later, cutting the mapping expedition short due to severe equipment failure. Raymond immediately submitted his digital data logs and the partial video recording to the Regional Marine Institute director. Within 6 hours of their arrival, a team of 4 plainclothes officials from a federal science and security agency arrived at the port. They boarded the ship, confiscated the laboratory's primary hard drives, seized the remaining spools of fiber optic cable, and placed the entire crew under a strict federal non-disclosure agreement. The incident was officially logged in the public archives as a catastrophic deep-sea cable failure caused by an underwater landslide along the Mendocino Fracture Zone. But what the Marine Institute's Internal Review Board discovered before the files were completely locked away is what turned this scientific observation into a classified nightmare. The acoustics technician, Ethan, had managed to save a 3-second backup of the hydrophone audio onto an encrypted personal flash drive before the federal agents arrived. When Raymond and a senior marine biologist analyzed the audio frequency in a private facility weeks later, they discovered that the dry, rapid clicking sound wasn't a random biological noise. The pattern of the bone clicks matched the exact cadence of a highly complex mathematical binary code. When translated through a standard military decryption algorithm, the repeating message inside the entity's clicking didn't contain coordinates or geological data. The short, hand-scratched translation read, "We are coming up." The federal agency permanently closed the marine coordinates around the Mendocino Cavern 3 months later, designating a 40-square-mile zone of the Pacific Ocean as a restricted military testing area, completely off-limits to commercial fishing, research vessels, and public navigation. Raymond Vance never boarded a research vessel again. He resigned from his Oceanographic Institute position, sold his home on the California coast, and relocated to a small, landlocked town in the high, arid plains of western Kansas, a place where the ground is flat dirt for hundreds of miles, the air is bone dry, and the nearest body of water is a shallow irrigation ditch. He managed to build a quiet, routine life as a high school earth science teacher, but the psychological scars of that May night remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to go near lakes or swimming pools, he cannot tolerate dark, quiet spaces, and he leaves a high-powered lantern burning on his nightstand 24 hours a day. Because, according to Raymond, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the creature's upside-down face or the snapping of the steel cable. The true horror lives in the realization of what is hidden beneath the surface of our world. Every time he looks at a map of the ocean or hears a faint, rhythmic chattering sound from a heating vent in his classroom, his entire body goes completely rigid. He realizes that humanity is just sailing on a thin, fragile surface of comfort, completely unaware that miles below the waves, in the absolute dark and crushing pressure of the deep abyss, something impossible is breathing, chattering its teeth, and waiting for the tide to turn.